Section 1. Two worlds on the same channel. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that two of the most recognizable animated families in the history of American television have always shared the same network. Both born on Fox, both airing on Sunday nights for the majority of their runs. Both centered on a heavy-set, not particularly intelligent father who loves beer, struggles at work, somehow maintains a marriage with a woman far better suited to a different life, stumbles through parenthood with a combination of catastrophic incompetence and occasionally surprising warmth. And yet these two shows, The Simpsons and Family Guy, could not be more different in the way they breathe, the way they think, the way they land a joke, and perhaps most importantly, in what they actually believe about the world and the people living in it. One show built its humor from the inside of its characters outward, constructing jokes that grew from who these people were and what they wanted and what they consistently failed to become. The other built its humor from the outside in, finding the laugh first and the character second, trusting that speed and surprise and the sheer volume of comedic content could carry an audience through 30 or 40 minutes of television without the need for deep emotional investment. If you are settling in right now, maybe the lights are low, maybe something warm is close by, and the night feels like a good one to sink into something long and familiar and absorbing. This is that thing. We are going to walk through every meaningful point of contact between these two giants of animated television. The shared DNA, the obvious differences, the bitter rivalry that simmered in writing rooms and spilled occasionally into the episodes themselves. The long years of the two shows circling each other in the Sunday night lineup like planets in adjacent orbits, close enough to exert gravitational influence on each other, but never quite colliding. And then the collision, the single most anticipated animated crossover in the history of American television, when the Griffin family drove into Springfield and nothing was ever quite the same again. This is a long one. It is meant to be long. The kind of long where you settle in and let it carry you, where you can close your eyes and still follow the story, because the story is told for ears as much as for eyes. We are going to start at the very beginning, before either show existed as anything more than a sketch on a piece of paper, and we are going to follow both of them all the way through their origins and their golden years and their rivalries and their declines and their crossover, to the place both shows occupy in the culture right now, which is somewhere between institution and artifact, somewhere between still running somehow and beloved forever regardless. To understand the crossover, you first need to understand the two worlds that produced it. You need to understand how Springfield was built and why Matt Groening built it the way he did. You need to understand how Quahog appeared a decade later and what it owed to its predecessor, and what it decided to do differently with everything it borrowed. You need to understand Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin as individual creations before you can understand what happens when they are placed in the same room. You need to understand the writers who built these worlds, the philosophies behind the comedy they were making, and the long and occasionally hostile relationship between two shows that were neighbors in every sense and rivals in almost every other. None of that can be rushed. None of it should be. So let the night get quiet. Let this be the thing you come back to. And let's begin at the beginning, with a man sitting in a Hollywood lobby, about to sketch out a family that would change what television was allowed to do. The Simpsons arrived first, not in 1989, which is when most people think the story starts, but in 1987, in a form so rough and primitive that fans of the modern show would barely recognize it. Matt Groening, at the time primarily known for a darkly funny newspaper comic strip called Life in Hell, found himself sitting in the lobby of producer James L. Brooks' office on the Paramount Pictures lot with a pitch meeting minutes away. Brooks had originally wanted Groening to adapt the Life in Hell characters, a depressed rabbit named Binky, his one-eared son Bongo, and an odd pair of identical roommates named Akbar and Jeff, for a series of animated bumpers on a new Fox variety program called The Tracy Ullman Show. But Groening, wary of surrendering the rights to characters he had built over years of independent work, made a decision in that lobby that would change the course of television history entirely. He sketched out an entirely new family on the spot. He named them after his own family, a father he called Homer, after his own father, a mother named Marge, after his own mother, a daughter named Lisa, and a baby named Maggie, after his sisters. The only character not named after a real family member was the son, an anagram of the word brat that Groening substituted for his own name. Those 5 sketches, produced in the lobby in the minutes before he walked into the pitch meeting, became the foundation of the longest-running scripted primetime series in American television history. The family was later given their distinctive yellow hue by a colorist named Georgi Palouse, who chose it specifically because it would pop on a television screen in a way that no other color quite managed. That yellow is one of the most consequential design decisions in the history of television branding. A visual distinctiveness that makes The Simpsons immediately recognizable even at a distance, even in a blurry thumbnail, even to someone who has never watched a single episode. More than the characters, more than the voices, more than any specific joke or catchphrase, that yellow is what made The Simpsons globally iconic. Those first animated shorts debuted on The Tracy Ullman Show on April 19th, 1987. And they were rough in a way that makes even devoted early Simpsons fans wince when they watch them today. The animation was barely there, just barely traced outlines from grunting sketches, produced by a tiny team of 3 animators at the Klasky Tsupo studio. The characters had an almost melted quality to them, their features still unresolved, their movements stilted and simple. But something in the tone was already present, something sardonic and loving at the same time. Something that understood American family life in a way that most television had been too polished and too optimistic to capture honestly. By 1989, Fox executives had seen enough. The shorts were the most talked about segments on The Ullman Show, outshining the main program to a degree that reportedly made Tracy Ullman uncomfortable. Producer James L. Brooks pushed for a full half-hour series. The Simpsons premiered as a standalone show on December 17th, 1989, with a Christmas episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. Around 13 million people watched it. A cultural phenomenon was born. Now hold that thought and let it sit while we move to another young man, a decade later, with a sketchbook and a head full of ideas. Seth MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, a small New England town that required him to import his ambitions from somewhere beyond its limits. He was drawing cartoons before he could form complete sentences. He had a locally published comic strip by the time he was 8 years old. He arrived at the Rhode Island School of Design with a singular goal: to make primetime animated television. His original plan as a student was to work for Disney. That plan evaporated somewhere around the time he fell in love with The Simpsons, which he later said made him understand that the kind of animated comedy he wanted to make was genuinely possible in prime time. That animation was not limited to children's entertainment, that it could be subversive and adult and weird, and still find an enormous audience on a major network. At RISD, MacFarlane made his senior thesis film, a short animated piece called The Life of Larry. It featured a heavyset, dim-witted, middle-aged man named Larry Cummings, his cynical talking dog named Steve, his patient wife also named Lois, and his overweight teenage son named Milt. If you have spent any time with Family Guy, you already know exactly who those characters became. Larry became Peter, Steve became Brian, the wife kept her name, the son became Chris. The baby genius who would later emerge as Stewie Griffin was not yet in the picture, but the bones of everything that would follow were already visible in that thesis film, and several of the specific gags from The Life of Larry appeared almost verbatim in early Family Guy episodes. A professor at RISD submitted MacFarlane's film to Hanna-Barbera on his behalf. He was hired immediately, not because of his drawing ability, but specifically because of the writing quality. He spent the next stretch working on Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken, learning the craft of animated comedy from the inside. In 1996, he created a sequel, short called Larry and Steve, that aired on Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon Showcase in 1997. Fox executives saw those Larry shorts and reached out. MacFarlane was given $50,000 and asked to create a 15-minute demo pilot. He presented it to Fox on May 15, 1998, and the network greenlit a full series on the spot. At age 24, Seth MacFarlane became the youngest executive producer in the history of American network television. Family Guy premiered on January 31, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33, in the most coveted time slot in all of broadcast television. 22 million people watched the premiere. The show that would spend the next 25 years in conversation, sometimes admiring, sometimes hostile, sometimes openly at war. With The Simpsons had arrived. And here, from the very first episode, the comparisons were inevitable. A heavy-set father, a beautiful, patient wife who is too good for him, two school-age kids and a baby, a talking animal family member with an interior life that the adults around him largely ignore. A fictional small American city as the setting. Sunday night on Fox. The parallels were structural, deliberate, and acknowledged by MacFarlane himself, who has said openly that The Simpsons was a direct influence. He was building on a tradition he admired, the way every new creator builds on what came before. But he was building something that would inevitably be compared to what came before, and sometimes unfavorably. Those comparisons shaped the entire history of both shows going forward. Understanding them is the key to understanding everything that followed. Every jab in the episodes, every diplomatic statement in the press, every moment where the two series circled each other in the Sunday night lineup, like ships passing in the same channel, aware of each other but never quite resolving their relationship into something simple. Until 2014, when they finally did. After this first section, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing. And if you have not subscribed yet, it takes 2 seconds and it means a great deal to this channel. Section 2. The Origins. How two worlds were built from the inside out. Every long-running television show is, in a sense, an autobiography of the people who made it. Not in the literal sense. Nobody is claiming that Matt Groening actually works at a nuclear power plant, or that Seth MacFarlane's father owned a brewery in Rhode Island. But the sensibility behind a show, the way it approaches humor, the things it finds worth satirizing, the level of warmth it allows its characters to express, the philosophy it brings to the question of what comedy is for, all of that comes from somewhere real. It comes from the person who conceived it, from their experiences and their influences and their instincts about what is funny and what is true. And it carries those fingerprints even decades later, even when the original creator has stepped back and handed the controls to someone else. Matt Groening grew up in Portland, Oregon, the son of a man named Homer and a woman named Margaret. His childhood, by his own description, was not miserable in any exceptional way. His father, the real Homer Groening, was a filmmaker and cartoonist who made industrial films and had a sardonic, wry sense of humor about the world that his son clearly inherited. His mother was a teacher. Groening himself was always the observant one, always the kid with a sketch pad, always the person in the room who noticed things and recorded them with a slightly jaundiced eye. Not bitter, but honest. Not cynical, but clear-eyed about the gap between what things were supposed to be and what they actually were. When he arrived in Los Angeles in the late 1970s, it was not with a clear plan. He worked a series of jobs that ranged from low-paying to genuinely absurd. And the entire time he was drawing a comic strip called Life in Hell, which he sold to alternative newspapers starting in 1980. Life in Hell was caustic and strange and deeply rooted in the specific disappointments of modern existence. In the gap between what life was supposed to feel like and what it actually felt like from the inside, day after day, in the real America rather than the television version of it. The strip found a large and devoted audience because it spoke honestly about things that polished mainstream media refused to acknowledge. It ran for 32 years. During that time, it appeared in over 250 weekly newspapers and generated a devoted readership that proved there was an audience for exactly the kind of sardonic, adult-oriented, emotionally honest comedy that Groening would later bring to primetime television. When he sketched out the Simpson family in that Paramount lobby in 1987, he was drawing on everything he had observed about the gap between promise and reality in American life. Homer was not a monster, but he was not the competent, cheerful patriarch of earlier television sitcoms either. He was tired and flawed and prone to making exactly the wrong decision at exactly the wrong moment. Marge was not a pushover. She had intelligence and opinions and genuine emotional authority. But she was also deeply committed to a version of family that required her to absorb an enormous amount of chaos. Bart was not the lovable scamp of earlier child characters on television. He was genuinely destructive, genuinely contemptuous of authority, and the show treated his rebellion not as a problem to be corrected, but as a perspective to be respected and examined. Lisa was the conscience of the family, the one who could see clearly what everyone else was too comfortable to acknowledge. And Maggie was the quiet presence, the perpetual infant whose few meaningful moments of expression always landed with more weight than they should have, because the show had trained you to expect nothing from her and then delivered something. The show Groening built, with enormous help from co-developer Sam Simon, whose contribution to the early character dynamics and writing room culture shaped the golden years in ways that are only fully visible in retrospect, was a satirical portrait of American life at the end of the 20th century. A show that could be genuinely funny and genuinely sad within the same scene. That could land a joke about consumerism and then, a few minutes later, cut to something so emotionally true that you felt it in your chest in a way that surprised you. The Simpsons was, at its peak, a comedy that cared about the people it was making fun of. That paradox, the idea that you can mock something and love it simultaneously, that the mocking and the loving can coexist in the same joke, was the engine that drove the best years of the show, and is the thing most clearly missing from its weaker periods. Sam Simon's role deserves more attention than it usually receives. Simon was a writer-producer who had worked on earlier comedies, including Taxi, and had a sophisticated understanding of story structure, character development, and the mechanics of how a joke builds meaning through context. He brought to The Simpsons an insistence on character-driven storytelling, the principle that every joke should grow out of a situation that told you something true about who these people were and what they wanted and what they consistently failed to achieve. That insistence shaped the writing room culture of the early seasons and established the standard against which every subsequent era of the show has been measured. Simon and Groening were, by multiple accounts, genuinely difficult colleagues for each other. Groening once described their relationship as very contentious. But the creative tension between Groening's anarchic imagination and Simon's structural discipline produced something that neither would have achieved alone. Seth MacFarlane's origin story differs in important ways. Where Groening was a cartoonist who backed into television, through an accidental lobby pitch, MacFarlane was someone who had always intended to make animated television and studied the craft systematically in order to do so. Where Groening's comedy was rooted in observation and character psychology, in the careful examination of what these specific people were like on the inside, MacFarlane's comedy was rooted in reference and surprise, in the sudden unexpected image, the absurd non sequitur, the joke that arrived from an entirely different direction than the one you were looking in. MacFarlane's sense of humor was shaped by a different constellation of influences. He loved old Hollywood, the classic musicals, the big band era, the theatrical entertainment of mid-century America with its exuberant professionalism. He loved Mel Brooks and Monty Python, and the particular flavor of creative chaos that comes from throwing incompatible things together at high speed. He also explicitly loved The Simpsons, but he saw it as a foundation to build on, rather than a template to follow precisely. What he built instead was something faster, stranger, and more deliberately disconnected. A comedy that did not particularly care whether its individual pieces connected to each other, as long as each piece was funny on its own terms, right then in the seconds it occupied. The writing staff that assembled around MacFarlane in those early Family Guy years was talented and genuinely diverse in its sensibilities, bringing different voices to a room that was still figuring out exactly what their show wanted to be. Unlike The Simpsons, which had the benefit of Sam Simon's highly structured approach and a theatrical tradition of comedy writing from which to draw, Family Guy was working more from instinct, more from the conviction that if something made the writers laugh hard enough in the room, it would work on screen. There was less emphasis on architecture and more on velocity. Both shows were shaped profoundly by the specific moment in American television history in which they existed. The Simpsons arrived at the end of the 1980s into a landscape dominated by comfortable, sanitized family sitcoms. The Cosby Show was the most popular program on television, and its success had produced a wave of imitators, all built on the reassuring premise that families work, parents know best, and problems resolve in 30 minutes with lessons learned. The Simpsons blew a hole in that wall. Critics initially were not sure what to make of it. Parents groups protested it. George H.W. Bush famously said during his 1992 re-election campaign that American families needed to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons, a statement that the show acknowledged in a subsequent episode with a joke that is still funny decades later. None of the controversy slowed the show down. In fact, the controversy accelerated its rise because it proved that the show was saying something real that powerful people found uncomfortable. Family Guy arrived 10 years later into a media landscape that The Simpsons itself had helped create. By 1999, animated adult comedy on primetime television was no longer a novelty. South Park had premiered in 1997 on Comedy Central and pushed the boundaries of what animation could say in ways that made even Family Guy look restrained by comparison. King of the Hill had shown that animated family comedy could be grounded and naturalistic. The Simpsons was 11 seasons in and beginning a drift from its own best instincts that would accelerate over the following decade. MacFarlane walked into that landscape with a show that understood all of its predecessors and chose to do something different from all of them. He was making a comedy that had no particular investment in psychological realism or emotional consistency. He wanted to make people laugh as fast as possible, as many times as possible, and he was willing to go anywhere to do it. The tension between those two philosophies, the Simpsons model of grounded character comedy, built from the inside out, and the Family Guy model of rapid-fire joke assembly built from the outside in, is the tension that defines the entire relationship between these shows. It produced some of the most interesting creative arguments in the history of American television comedy. And it would eventually produce a crossover episode that attempted, imperfectly and sometimes brilliantly, to bring those philosophies into direct contact with each other. Section 3. Springfield versus Quahog, the architecture of two fictional worlds. There is a scene in one of the most beloved Simpsons episodes of the 1990s where Homer, standing in the middle of a convenience store, is suddenly overtaken by a daydream about a magical land he calls the Chocolate Land, where the buildings are made of chocolate and chocolate rain falls gently from a chocolate sky. He bites a piece off a chocolate man walking past him. The chocolate man, in a tone that suggests mild surprise rather than pain or offense, says, "Hey, stop that." And then Homer snaps back to reality and keeps shopping, as if nothing happened, as if briefly visiting a magical chocolate dimension was just a routine interruption in an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. That scene is Springfield in miniature, a place where the extraordinary sits next to the mundane without anyone particularly remarking on it. A place where a nuclear power plant run by a cartoonishly evil billionaire is simply a fact of local employment, where a mob boss operates in relative public openness, where a hospital functions in a way that suggests the doctors may have been trained through correspondence courses, and where the local bar is staffed by a man named Mo who appears to have never, in 35 years of continuous operation, had a genuinely good day. Springfield is extraordinary in its detail, specific in its recurring geography, and consistent enough across hundreds of episodes that it has developed the quality of a real place. Groening has said that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, the small city near Portland where he grew up, but deliberately kept its state ambiguous so that audiences everywhere could recognize something of their own hometown in it. The show exploits this ambiguity constantly and with great pleasure, producing episodes that appear to locate Springfield in multiple different states, depending on what the plot requires. These contradictions are not mistakes. They are design choices serving a clear purpose. Springfield was always meant to be every town USA. Specific enough to feel real, vague enough to belong to everyone watching. What makes Springfield feel genuinely lived in the best years of the show is the extraordinary depth and consistency of its supporting cast. The town is populated by characters who have psychologies, histories, and relationships extending far beyond any single episode. Ned Flanders, the cheerfully devout neighbor, is a man whose relentless positivity is eventually revealed to be a coping mechanism developed in childhood, the result of therapeutic intervention after a period of profound behavioral chaos that his deeply permissive parents failed to address. That backstory arrives in a single surprising episode called Hurricane Nettie and recontextualizes everything the audience thought they knew about Ned. Apu Nahasapima Petalon, the proprietor of the Quick E-Mart, is a character whose depiction has been rightly complicated by later generations of critics who pointed out the problems inherent in a South Asian character designed primarily for accent-based comedy, voiced by a white actor. These criticisms are legitimate and important. But in the golden years, Apu was also written with genuine interiority, a man with an advanced degree who ended up managing a convenience store, navigating a life between cultures with a dignity the show occasionally acknowledged, alongside the comedy it extracted from his circumstances. Chief Wiggum carries a strange dignity in his total incompetence. He is not cruel, just thoroughly unqualified, which the show treats as a more interesting problem than actual malevolence. Principal Skinner has layers. Sideshow Bob has tragedy built into his comic villainy. Even Barney Gumble, whose alcoholism might have been pure slapstick in a lesser show, has moments of genuine pathos that make him feel like a person rather than a joke. Mr. Burns is one of the great comic villains in the history of any medium. He works not because he is frightening in any conventional sense, but because he is so perfectly calibrated as a portrait of wealth, so extreme it has lost all connection to human feeling. He is old beyond what the show will specify, and his detachment from ordinary human experience has made him something like a cartoon of pure capitalism, a force without restraint, operating at the intersection of power and senility. And yet the show finds moments of genuine pathos in him too, particularly when episodes reveal the extraordinary loneliness at the center of his life. His relationship with Smithers, his faithful and devoted assistant, is one of the show's most consistent, long-running stories. A kind of love that exists in a form both parties can inhabit, but neither can fully name. The relationship between Springfield and the Simpson family is symbiotic in a way that matters enormously to how the show works. Springfield needs the Simpsons to stumble through its institutions, to push against its social norms, to be the family most visibly struggling with the contradiction between the American dream and the American reality. And the Simpsons need Springfield to give them a world large enough to explore, consistent enough that when something changes, the audience notices and feels it. When a character the audience knows well appears in a Springfield context they haven't seen before, the show gets comedy from recognition, from the pleasure of knowing these people well enough that seeing them somewhere new produces something. That comedy requires investment in both the world and the characters, investment that accumulates over years of consistent attention. Quahog, Rhode Island is built on different principles, and understanding those different principles is key to understanding what Family Guy was doing and why it worked differently. Where Springfield is every town, Quahog is specifically and deliberately a Rhode Island city. Small state energy, East Coast personality, a cultural particularity that the show invokes and immediately uses for comedic contrast. Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, a stand-in for the very real Narragansett beer brand long associated with Rhode Island's working-class culture. The gang drinks at the Drunken Clam, a bar whose name carries a particular flavor of New England coastal specificity. These details root the show in a particular regional identity. But Quahog as a place functions differently from Springfield as a place. In Family Guy, the town is less a living ecosystem with its own internal coherence and more a stage, a backdrop against which the Griffin family's comedy plays out, populated by recurring characters who exist primarily when the story requires them. Mayor Adam West, played by the real Adam West in one of the most delightful pieces of self-aware casting in animated television history, is a recurring presence whose function is comic non sequitur rather than meaningful civic presence. Tom Tucker, the local news anchor, delivers absurdist headlines that set up cutaway gags rather than illuminating anything about the community he ostensibly serves. The evil monkey who lives in Chris's closet exists purely as a running gag with no connection to anything beyond itself. This is not a criticism so much as an accurate description of two fundamentally different approaches to world building and animated comedy. Springfield asks you to know it, to invest in its geography and its residents and its history, because that investment is what makes the comedy possible. Quahog asks you to accept it, to treat it as a backdrop sufficiently consistent to hold the story while the comedy happens in front of it. Springfield is a character. Quahog is a location. What both towns share is their relationship to a certain kind of ordinary American life, the life of the family that is not wealthy or powerful or exceptional, that exists in the middle of a country and a culture that is always promising something just slightly better than what it delivers. Both shows chose to center those ordinary families and to find in their ordinary lives something worth spending half an hour with every week. The difference is in what they chose to find. The Simpsons found depth in the ordinariness. The family's struggles with money, with ambition, with the gap between who they wanted to be and who they actually were, these were not just comic premises. They were emotional truths that the best episodes explored with a level of honesty and specificity that serious drama rarely achieved. The comedy and the feeling were not separate things. They produced each other. Family Guy found speed in the ordinariness. The family's struggles were the launching pad for an enormous number of tangents, references, and sudden diversions that had nothing to do with those struggles. The comedy existed in the spaces between the story's beats, in the cutaway gags and non sequiturs and references that arrived from nowhere and departed just as quickly. The ordinariness was the container, not the content. Both approaches work when executed well. Both can produce work that fails entirely. The argument about which approach is inherently superior is ultimately an argument about what you want from comedy, and that is not an argument that has ever been resolved or ever will be. Section 4. The Fathers, Homer Simpson, and Peter Griffin. In full. Let us start with what everyone already knows, because ignoring it would be a disservice to the real conversation. Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin are, on the surface, remarkably similar people. Both are heavy-set in a way that is central to their physical comedy. Both are blue-collar workers in their respective universes. Homer operates a console at the Springfield nuclear power plant, a job he got through what appears to be catastrophic mismanagement of the hiring process rather than any relevant qualification. Peter has worked at various points at a toy factory, a brewery, and a bewildering array of other positions that change based on what the episode requires. Both drink with a frequency and enthusiasm that would be alarming in the real world, and is treated as a character trait so fundamental it rarely requires comment. Both have a temper that fires without warning and subsides without real resolution, often leaving damage in its wake that the episode acknowledges and then moves past. Both are married to women who are by any objective measure more intelligent, more capable, more patient, and more emotionally sophisticated than they are. Both have 3 children. Both have a dog that functions as more than a pet, Santa's little helper in Springfield, Brian and Quahog, though the nature of Brian's presence in his show is so unusual that the comparison requires its own section. Both have a bar where they drink with their male friends, and in both shows that bar serves as a narrative hub. The place where the protagonist goes to be a version of himself separate from his role as husband and father, and usually the source of the bad ideas that drive the episode's plot forward. Homer's bar is Moe's Tavern, a dive of almost aggressive unpleasantness run by Moe Sheeslak, a man whose face has been described within the show as something that frightens children and stops clocks. Moe is loyal to his regulars in a way that reads as the desperate attachment of someone who has nothing else, and his devotion to Homer's friend group is one of the show's most consistently touching running dynamics. The regulars include Lenny and Carl, Homer's co-workers, whose friendship with Homer is long and deep and occasionally examined with real feeling, and Barney Gumble, whose alcoholism is both a running gag and, in the show's best moments, something genuinely sad. Peter's bar is the Drunken Clam, a considerably cleaner establishment whose cast of regulars includes Glenn Quagmire, Joe Swanson, and in the early seasons, Cleveland Brown. These 4 form a friendship group that functions similarly to Homer's bar circle, the world outside the home, the place where Peter goes to be a version of himself unconstrained by the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage, and almost invariably the source of whatever scheme or misadventure drives the episode. The specific chemistry of the Drunken Clam group is different from Moe's, sharper, more rapid-fire, less emotionally exposed, but the structural function is almost identical. These similarities were not incidental. MacFarlane has acknowledged them directly. The structural parallels between the two families are the primary reason that Simpsons fans, particularly in the early years of Family Guy, were skeptical at best and actively hostile at worst about what they perceived as imitation. The Simpsons addressed it directly in multiple episodes, most memorably in a 2006 episode called The Italian Bob, in which a book of known criminals includes a photograph of Peter Griffin with the crime listed as plagiarismo, Italian for plagiarism. The joke was unambiguous and intentional, and it reflected genuine feeling in the Simpsons writing room. But here's where the comparison becomes genuinely interesting, because once you get past the structural similarities, Homer and Peter are actually very different people in ways that reveal fundamentally different things about what each show thinks it is doing. Homer Simpson, at his best, and let us be precise about what we mean by best, which is Homer as he existed during the golden years, roughly from season 3 through season 8, is a man who contains multitudes in a way that makes him one of the most fully realized comic characters in television history. He is lazy and gluttonous and frequently selfish and occasionally cowardly in ways that are almost admirable in their completeness. He is catastrophically impulsive. He has made decisions so stupid that they beggar description, designing a car so terrible it bankrupted his long-lost brother's entire company. Getting both his arms stuck in separate vending machines simultaneously, refusing to let go of the snacks inside either one. Once believing he could fake his own death to avoid attending a school reunion, a plan that unraveled within minutes in ways he did not foresee. The stupidity of Homer Simpson in those early seasons was not just comedy. It was a portrait of a specific kind of person, the person who genuinely means well, who loves his family and wants good things for himself and the people around him, but who simply cannot connect his desires reliably to the actions required to achieve them. His brain fires in a particular way that makes him wonderful in specific, unpredictable moments. Moments of unexpected insight, unexpected tenderness, unexpected courage, and catastrophically unreliable in the moments when ordinary competence would serve perfectly well. He is not dumb in a way that precludes humanity. He is dumb in a way that is entirely compatible with being a full, complicated human person, which is what makes him funny rather than merely pathetic. And yet, Homer loves his family with a fullness that the show returns to again and again in ways that feel earned rather than imposed. The moments where Homer does something genuinely good, where he stands up for Bart against an unfair authority figure, where he stays up all night trying to fix something he broke for Marge, where he sits with Lisa and finds a way to connect with her across the enormous gulf between his mind and hers. These moments work because they grow organically out of who Homer actually is. He is a man fighting against his own worst tendencies. He does not always win that fight, but he keeps fighting it, and that effort is what makes him lovable rather than simply laughable. Consider the one fish, two fish episode. Homer eats a blowfish at a sushi restaurant. He is told he has approximately 24 hours to live. What he does with those hours is the episode's entire subject and its entire emotional content. He makes a video message for baby Maggie because she will not be old enough to remember him. He takes Bart to a father-son picnic they have always meant to attend and never managed to. He reconciles with his own father, in a scene so simple and so painful and so true that it is almost impossible to believe it exists in the middle of a cartoon. He stays up through the night listening to jazz, waiting for sunrise. And then he wakes up. The blowfish wasn't fatal. He survived. And his immediate response to surviving, his return to the couch, to the television to the comfortable inertia of ordinary life, is funny and sad and honest all at once. The man who had 24 hours to be the person he always meant to be has immediately reverted to the person he actually is. But something has shifted. The audience has seen what Homer contains, and they carry that knowledge forward through everything else they watch him do. That is character-based comedy operating at its highest level. The joke at the end requires the emotional journey of the episode to land. You cannot separate the comedy from the feeling because one produces the other. Peter Griffin in the early seasons of Family Guy was built on a genuinely similar foundation. He was a man who meant well and consistently failed to translate that good intention into good behavior. He loved Lois. He loved his kids, even when he was neglecting them. His stupidity had a warm quality to it. He made bad decisions, not out of cruelty, but out of the specific kind of obliviousness that makes a person charming and infuriating in equal measure. When he messed up, which was constantly, there was usually a recognition at the end of the episode that he knew he had messed up and wanted to do better. He apologized. He tried again. The cycle of error and reconciliation that made Homer emotionally navigable was present in Peter too, in those early seasons. What happened to Peter over the course of Family Guy's run is one of the most discussed and debated character arcs in animated television history. The transformation from warm-hearted fool to something closer to a force of chaos operating without meaningful consequence or accountability happened gradually, season by season, in increments small enough that any single change seemed unremarkable, but the accumulation was enormous. By the later seasons, Peter was doing things, to Lois, to his children, to his friends, that the character of the first 3 seasons would never have done. Not because he lacked the impulse, but because he possessed something the later Peter has lost. A recognizable emotional interior that his actions had to remain connected to, even when the connection was strained. The difference between Homer's decline and Peter's decline is a difference of degree and of foundation. Homer's decline happened in a show that had built, over its golden years, a psychological portrait of its lead character so detailed and so humanely rendered that even the lesser seasons were working against a richly established foundation. When Homer did something cruel or gratuitously stupid in a later season, the audience could see exactly what was being betrayed, because the original had been drawn so clearly. The betrayal was visible because the original was so present. Peter's trajectory is harder to read in quite the same way, partly because Family Guy was never as invested in building psychological depth for its characters as The Simpsons was during its peak. Peter was always somewhat more of a comic mechanism than a psychological portrait. The shift from warm-hearted foolishness to something colder and more troubling happened over many seasons, and was the cumulative result of many individual choices, none of which seemed catastrophic in isolation. The audience adjusted along with the show, season by season, without necessarily noticing how far they had traveled from where they started. Both characters, when placed side by side in the 2014 crossover episode, produce interesting results precisely because of these differences. Homer, in The Simpsons Guy, is portrayed as the kinder and more generous of the two patriarchs, the one who extends welcome to the stranded Griffin family, who tries to make them comfortable, who responds to Peter's disruptions with more patience than Peter deserves. This is partly a dramatic choice. The episode needed a host and a disruptor, and Homer was cast as the host. But it is also consistent with who Homer actually is at his core, even in his post-Golden Age form. The warmth is still there even when the writing around it has become more erratic. When Homer steps into the role of Peter's giant chicken in the crossover's 8-minute fight sequence, when he absorbs and delivers violence at a scale that his own show would never permit, there is a visible friction between the Homer the audience knows and the context he has been placed in. The comedy comes partly from the fight itself and partly from that friction, from the awareness that Homer Simpson is doing something that Homer Simpson would not do, that he has been imported into a Family Guy sequence and is operating by Family Guy rules, and that the difference between those rules and the ones his own show lives by is something the audience can feel even without consciously articulating it. That friction is the crossover's most honest quality. It does not resolve the difference between these two shows. It makes it visible. Section 5. The rest of the families. Partners, children, and what they reveal. Marge Simpson is one of the most significantly underrated characters in the history of American television comedy, animated or otherwise. She is consistently the most emotionally intelligent person in every room she enters, and the show spent its golden years examining what it actually costs to be the most emotionally intelligent person in every room you enter, when those rooms are occupied by Homer Simpson and the residents of Springfield, a community that has never placed a particularly high premium on emotional intelligence. Julie Kavner's voice work defines the character in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. That particular quality in Kavner's voice, the hoarseness, the way it carries both amusement and exhaustion in the same breath, the specific warmth embedded in her exasperation, makes Marge feel like a real person in a way that many animated characters never achieve. There is something in Kavner's delivery that communicates an entire life of choosing patience over reaction, and it makes every moment where Marge's patience genuinely runs out land with a weight that a less carefully established character could never produce. When Marge finally loses it in an episode, you believe it because you have watched her not losing it across dozens of episodes leading up to that moment. The restraint was real. The breaking point is real. In the golden years, Marge had episodes that belonged to her, that examined her inner life with real curiosity and real care rather than simply using her as a stabilizing presence for the chaos around her. Marge versus the Monorail is usually discussed in terms of the Lyle Landley character and the famous musical number. But at its core, it is an episode about what happens when the one competent person in a community is outvoted by everyone else's enthusiasm for a shiny bad idea, which is something Marge knows a great deal about from daily domestic experience. Scenes from the class struggle in Springfield follows Marge as she discovers a talent for golf that briefly gains her access to Springfield's upper-class social world, and then has to choose between that world and the one she already has. The episode understands something specific and true about class aspiration and what it costs, Ba'akawa, about the way self-improvement can become self-betrayal if you stop being careful about which self you are improving. Lois Griffin occupies a structurally similar position in Family Guy, but with a different emotional texture and ultimately different treatment by the show. She is also the most capable adult in her household. She is also the one holding the family together with patience and increasing exasperation. Alex Borstein's voice work brings a specific New England quality to Lois, a slightly sharp, slightly nasal quality that suggests someone who has always been more pragmatic than romantic about the life she is living. The voice communicates competence and a certain kind of toughness that is entirely appropriate for a woman married to Peter Griffin. But Lois's role in the show has been more variable than Marge's. In the post-revival seasons, Family Guy began revealing a darker side of Lois, her own capacity for cruelty, manipulation, and self-serving behavior, that either made her more complex or undermined her function, depending on what you needed her to be. The show has been less interested in maintaining the consistency of Lois's core character than The Simpsons has been in maintaining Marge's. This reflects the show's different priorities around character consistency more broadly. The Simpsons, at its best, protected its characters' cores even when pushing their behavior to extremes. Family Guy has been more willing to sacrifice character consistency for a story or a laugh. Both women are defined more heavily by their relationships to their husbands than by their own distinct narratives, which is a genuine limitation of both shows. But Marge, in the golden years, had episodes that belonged entirely to her and said something specific and true about the kind of woman she was and the kind of world she was navigating. That specificity is what the character required, and the show delivered it often enough to make Marge feel like a person rather than a role. Bart Simpson and Stewie Griffin occupy the same structural position in their respective shows, the child characters who most clearly articulate something transgressive and surprising about the premise. But the nature of the transgression is entirely different, and that difference tells you almost everything about what each show is trying to do with its most interesting young character. Bart is a rebel. He rejects the authority of the school, the family, and the social world around him with a cheerful consistency that the show treats not as a problem, but as a perspective, as one valid way of responding to institutions that frequently deserve the contempt directed at them. His relationship with Homer is the emotional heart of many of the best Simpsons episodes, a father who does not understand his son, and a son who does not understand his father. Both of them trying and failing and occasionally succeeding in ways that feel genuinely affecting. Nancy Cartwright's voice work as Bart is one of the most remarkable casting decisions in television history. A woman in her late 20s voicing a 10-year-old boy, and the specific quality she brings to it, the slightly raspy, slightly too old voice, the perfect calibration between insolence and vulnerability, is so completely right that the idea of anyone else in the role is almost unthinkable. Bart's cultural impact in the early 1990s was a phenomenon without parallel in Family Guy's history. The Bart Mania of 1990 and 1991, when Bart Simpson appeared on millions of t-shirts and hats and skateboards and became a genuine symbol of youthful irreverence, is one of the most extraordinary examples of an animated character transcending their show to become a cultural artifact in its own right. Stewie Griffin, in his original form, was one of the most genuinely original character concepts in the history of animated television. A baby barely 1 year old, speaking with a refined British accent, building advanced weapons in his bedroom, plotting world domination and the murder of his mother with the methodical focus that most infants devote to learning to walk. The comedy was rooted entirely in dramatic irony. The audience heard what this baby was actually saying, and the fact that nobody else could understand him made every interaction between Stewie and the other characters a kind of dark comedy of miscommunication that accumulated meaning as the seasons built on it. That Stewie was genuinely dangerous in a way that made every scene with him carry a particular charge. He was unpredictable in a direction that was actually threatening rather than merely chaotic. He had a memory for grievances, a precision in his revenge, and a collection of laser weapons in a crib. Brian was the only character who could hear and understand him, and that single fact created the foundation for one of the more unusual and genuinely charming relationships in animated television. A talking baby genius and a talking dog intellectual, finding each other in a household that could accommodate neither of them. The evolution of Stewie over the course of Family Guy, from world domination-obsessed evil genius to emotionally vulnerable, insecurity-driven character searching for connection and identity, is something the show itself has acknowledged as deliberate. The writers felt the evil baby concept had been exhausted. They moved him toward a different kind of story. Whether that movement represented growth or loss is a genuine creative question with no simple answer. What is undeniable is that the Stewie of later seasons is a fundamentally different character from the Stewie of seasons 1 through 3, and the original version was more genuinely unique. There are hundreds of animated characters who are emotionally insecure and searching for their identity. There was only one evil genius baby who kept a laser cannon under the floorboards. Then there is the daughter situation, and this is where the comparison between the shows becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Lisa Simpson is one of the great characters in American television across any medium or genre. She is intellectually precocious, morally serious, and perpetually at odds with a world that does not particularly value what she has to offer. She plays jazz saxophone with genuine skill. She is a vegetarian, a Buddhist, an environmentalist in a family and a town that regards all three commitments as eccentric at best. She cares about justice and beauty and truth in a community that mostly values entertainment and comfort. Episodes built around Lisa in the golden years treated her complexity with genuine respect, found in her the conscience of the show, the voice through whom the series could express its own values without becoming preachy, because Lisa's advocacy was always filtered through her very specific and somewhat lonely experience of being the smartest and most sensitive person in any given room. Meg Griffin began as a concept recognizably similar to Lisa, if considerably simpler. The ordinary teenager in an extraordinary family. The one who just wanted to fit in and be loved, whose failure to achieve either generated gentle comedy in the early episodes. The original Meg was treated with a casual indifference that was different from cruelty. She was unremarkable rather than unwanted. What happened to Meg over the following decade, the sustained and escalating campaign of abuse and degradation her character underwent across nearly 10 seasons, is one of the darkest chapters in the history of American animated comedy. By the middle of the show's run, every member of the Griffin family was treating Meg with open contempt. Peter was actively and physically hostile. Lois was coldly dismissive. Chris participated when convenient. The entire household had organized itself around Meg as a shared target, and the show was presenting this as comedy, as something the audience was expected to find entertaining rather than disturbing. The contrast between Lisa and Meg is the sharpest illustration of the difference in what these two shows fundamentally believe about their characters. Lisa is a person with a full inner life whom the show takes seriously, even when the world within the show does not. Meg was progressively reduced to a function, the function of receiving abuse, a character who existed not to illuminate teenage experience, but to be hurt for the audience's entertainment. The show eventually pulled back from the worst of this, beginning around season 14, reportedly in part because the addition of more women to the writing staff created internal pressure against the constant cruelty toward the show's main female teenager. But the damage of the intervening years was real and lasting, and the contrast with how The Simpsons treated Lisa says something important about the different values at work in these two shows. Chris and Bart offer a smaller but still meaningful comparison. Both are the teenage sons, both are somewhat underutilized. Bart carries a weight of cultural significance that Chris has never achieved. The Bart mania of the early 1990s gave Bart an independent existence beyond the show that Chris has never developed. Chris is a solid comic character who is underutilized in ways the show occasionally acknowledges but never fully addresses. Bart is an icon. Chris is a supporting player. Maggie and Stewie as babies offer the most interesting formal parallel. Maggie's near-total silence is its own kind of eloquence, the few moments where she acts with clear intention, like the Season 6 cliffhanger in which she appears responsible for shooting Mr. Burns, land with outsized force precisely because they are so rare. Stewie's loquaciousness was his entire point in the original conception. The comedy depended on the contrast between his extraordinary expression and his complete inability to be heard or understood. Both babies function as comic wildcards within their respective families. Both represent the specific imaginative freedom that animation offers. The freedom to put extraordinary things inside an ordinary package and see what happens when nobody notices. Section 6. The humor, two philosophies of comedy in direct competition. The most fundamental difference between The Simpsons and Family Guy is not about characters or settings or storytelling structure. It is about what kind of comedy each show believes in, about the philosophical position each show takes on the question of what comedy is for and how it should work. The Simpsons, particularly in its golden years, was a comedy built on layers. A joke in a classic Simpsons episode might work on 3 or 4 different levels simultaneously. The surface gag that makes you laugh on first contact, the reference it was making to something in American culture, the character truth it was revealing about who these specific people were, and sometimes a satirical observation about something larger that the situation was illuminating. The jokes grew from the story. They were not imported into the story from outside. You could not lift a Simpsons joke from its episode and place it in a different episode without losing something essential, because the joke was embedded in a context that gave it meaning beyond its surface content. The writers who built this approach were working with unusual rigor about what the comedy was doing at any given moment. Conan O'Brien, who wrote for the show in the early 1990s before departing for Late Night, has described the writer's room process as extraordinarily demanding. Every joke was revisited multiple times in multiple drafts, tested against the question of whether this was the best possible version of what it was trying to do, whether it revealed something true about the character, whether it was earning the comedy through crowd, rather than simply generating a laugh through surprise. The room had a culture of excellence that was punishing, but that produced work of extraordinary consistency. John Swartzwelder, who wrote many of what fans consider the single best episodes of the show, worked largely in isolation from the room but produced scripts with a density of joke work and a precision of comedic construction that set a standard the room constantly aspired to match. His approach was a kind of deadpan surrealism, treating the most absurd premises with complete sincerity, finding the comedy in the gap between the extravagance of what was happening and the earnestness with which every character responded to it. His episode You Only Move Twice, in which Homer stumbles into a job, working for the most cheerful and efficient supervillain imaginable without ever quite understanding what is going on around him, is the episode most frequently cited as the best single episode the show produced. Albert Brooks' performance as Hank Scorpio, the supervillain who genuinely seems to care about his employees and takes real pleasure in Homer's success, is calibrated with such imperfect enthusiasm that the whole thing achieves something close to comic grace. The comedy works at every level simultaneously. The surface absurdity, the satirical point about corporate enthusiasm and its discontents, and the emotional truth of Homer experiencing what it feels like to have a boss who actually appreciates him. The Simpsons at its best was also a show that understood the specific value of the unexpected emotional sucker punch. The moment in a fundamentally comedic episode where something genuinely moving happens that the comedy has made possible rather than undermined. The scene in Lisa's Substitute where the substitute teacher has left and Lisa receives a note he wrote for her, telling her that her loneliness is the loneliness of someone ahead of her time, that the people around her will catch up, that she should be patient with the world, is one of the most purely affecting moments in the history of television comedy. It works because the show has spent the episode building a portrait of Lisa's specific isolation with enough care and specificity that the resolution lands with full force. The comedy around it is what makes the feeling possible. They are not separate things. Family Guy's comedy philosophy is rooted in different principles, and those principles produce a different relationship between the show and its audience. The cutaway gag, in which a character makes a comparison or reference that triggers a cut to an entirely separate, self-contained scene before the story resumes, was not invented by Family Guy. The Simpsons used cutaways. Other comedies used them. But Family Guy made the cutaway the primary engine of its comedy in a way that had not been done before, and that choice defined everything about how the show works and how it is experienced. In a classic Family Guy cutaway, a character says something like, "This is worse than the time I," and the screen cuts to Peter in a situation completely unrelated to the main story. Auditioning for a Broadway musical, meeting a historical figure in an implausible context, participating in an event that the laws of physics would not normally allow. The gag is self-contained. It exists entirely within itself. When it ends and the story resumes, nothing has changed. The gag has not advanced the plot, has not revealed anything about the characters, has not connected to anything that came before or will come after. Its only function is to be funny in the 30 to 60 seconds it occupies. The virtue of this approach is remarkable efficiency and flexibility. Family Guy can pack an enormous quantity of jokes into a single episode because it is not limited to jokes that arise organically from its characters and situations. If a joke is funny enough in isolation, it can appear in the show regardless of whether it connects to anything happening in the episode around it. This is what makes Family Guy clips so portable and shareable on the internet. Each gag is already a complete, self-contained artifact that does not require context to deliver its laugh. The limitation of this approach is depth. When jokes do not arise from character and situation, they do not reveal anything about character or situation. They are pure entertainment, which has genuine value, but they do not accumulate meaning in the way that character-embedded comedy accumulates meaning. A viewer who has never watched Family Guy before can laugh at a Family Guy cutaway gag just as easily as a viewer who has watched every episode, because the gag is completely independent of the context surrounding it. The same is not true of the best Simpsons jokes, which reward familiarity and attention in ways that cutaway gags structurally cannot. This distinction between comedy that emerges from character and comedy that exists independently of character is the philosophical heart of every debate that has ever been had about these two shows. Partisans of The Simpsons tend to believe that comedy embedded in character and story has more value because it does more than one thing at a time. Partisans of Family Guy tend to believe that laughter is the primary function of comedy and that the mechanism by which laughter is produced is secondary to whether the laughter actually occurs. Neither position is indefensible. South Park's Trey Parker and Matt Stone entered this argument publicly and loudly in 2006 with the two-part Cartoon Wars episodes, which depicted Family Guy's writing staff as trained manatees selecting random word-covered beach balls from a tank to assemble cutaway gags. The implication that the jokes were so disconnected from any coherent comic logic that they could have been generated randomly was funny and accurate in ways that McFarlane himself later acknowledged, calling the episode funny and accurate in a 2012 Rolling Stone interview. The Simpsons writing room reportedly sent flowers to the South Park team after the episodes aired. King of the Hill writers called to express their gratitude. The specific word Parker used to describe the response was animation solidarity, a sense among shows that had built their comedy on character and story that the manatee critique was something they all endorsed. The Simpsons writing room also made a quieter but equally revealing gesture. As documented in DVD commentary, showrunner Al Jean described how the Simpsons room had been using cutaways with increasing frequency until Family Guy's arrival, and its total ownership of the format prompted them to pull back from the technique entirely. Once they were copying us, Jean said, producer James L. Brooks simply responded, and then we knew it was dead. The Simpsons writing staff was so uncomfortable with being associated with Family Guy's approach to the gag that they retired the technique rather than continue to be confused with a show they regarded as derivative. The technical craft of both shows at their best is genuinely impressive in different ways. The Simpsons at its peak was a masterclass in comic construction. The setup, the misdirection, the payoff, the secondary payoff that arrives just when you thought the joke was over. The way the show used background gags, the way it planted details in one scene that would pay off 3 scenes later. The way it could execute an emotional reversal in a few seconds of animation that would take a live-action show several minutes of screen time to achieve. All of this represented comedy writing at the highest possible level of craft. Family Guy at its best demonstrated a different kind of mastery. The mastery of timing within the self-contained gag, the ability to find exactly the right degree of escalation and exactly the right moment to cut away. The courage to commit to an absurd premise for far longer than conventional comedy wisdom would suggest, and to find comedy in that very commitment. The giant chicken fights are the most famous example. Sequences that run for 5, 6, 7 minutes across multiple seasons, that escalate in violence and absurdity until they become something more like performance art than conventional comedy, but that achieve genuine comedy precisely because of their refusal to stop when a lesser show would have stopped. Section 7. The Cultural Rivalry. Writing Rooms at War. To understand the cultural position of The Simpsons and Family Guy relative to each other in the early 2000s, you have to understand what the animated comedy landscape looked like and felt like at that particular moment. The Simpsons had reigned supreme since its debut, and then Family Guy arrived in 1999, riding the wave of audience goodwill that The Simpsons had generated for the entire category of adult animated comedy on primetime television, immediately pulling comparable audiences to a show that looked, to critics and to Simpsons loyalists, like a structural copy of the one they already loved. The Simpsons writing room, which had spent a decade establishing that animated comedy could be genuinely sophisticated, found itself confronted with a show that used the form to do something they did not particularly respect. The first years of the relationship were characterized by cautious distance. Both shows were on the same network, both ran on Sunday nights, and Fox had obvious financial interest in them getting along. MacFarlane has said multiple times that he and Groening have a genuinely good relationship, and there is no reason to doubt this. But the writers' rooms were not the creators. The writers' rooms had feelings that occasionally escaped into the episodes themselves. The Simpsons began dropping references to Family Guy into their episodes with a frequency that could not have been accidental. In the season 14 Treehouse of Horror episode, one of Homer's identical clones has the face of Peter Griffin. The joke required no explanation. Peter Griffin appearing as a Homer clone was the show saying clearly and deliberately exactly what it thought about the relationship between the two characters. A few seasons later, in The Italian Bob, the Book of Criminals includes Peter Griffin under the label plagiarismo. Again, unambiguous, intentional, and reflecting genuine feeling in the room. Family Guy's response in those early years was more oblique. The show made occasional jokes about its relationship with The Simpsons, but Family Guy did not have The Simpsons' writing room's appetite for direct combat. It was more interested in continuing to do what it did than in defending what it did against the competition. The most significant outside intervention in this rivalry came in 2006 when South Park dedicated 2 full episodes, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2, to mocking Family Guy specifically. The episodes were inspired in part by an upcoming Family Guy episode that would depict the Prophet Muhammad, which touched on a controversy involving Danish newspaper cartoons. But the Muhammad subplot was, in retrospect, secondary to the real subject of the episodes: the quality of Family Guy's writing, and whether it deserved to exist alongside shows that took comedy more seriously as a craft. In Cartoon Wars, the Family Guy studio is revealed to employ not human writers, but a group of trained manatees who live in a large tank and select random beach balls inscribed with words, laundry, Mexico, Gary Coleman, and push them into a machine that produces cutaway gags. The implication is that the gags are constructed randomly, that no creative intelligence is involved, that the comedy requires no craft because it can be generated by chance. Cartman delivers the critique explicitly. I am nothing like Family Guy. When I make jokes, they are inherent to a story. Deep situational and emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point, not just one random interchangeable joke after another. Parker and Stone have been direct about the fact that this was their actual position, and not merely comedic exaggeration. They do not respect Family Guy's writing. After the episodes aired, Parker received what he described as something close to universal support from the rest of the animated comedy community: flowers from The Simpsons, phone calls from King of the Hill, a general atmosphere of animation solidarity around the shared critique. MacFarlane's response was largely gracious. He called the Cartoon Wars episode funny and accurate in a 2012 interview. What bothered him was not the comedic criticism, but the press statements in which Parker and Stone expressed their contempt outside the context of jokes. "I don't understand the personal venom they spew in the press about the show and about me, where it's not in the context of a joke," McFarlane said. He was specifically protective of his writing staff, who bore the brunt of the manatee metaphor even though McFarlane was the primary target. The internet, meanwhile, was building a permanent infrastructure for this argument that no single interview or episode could resolve. Message boards and forums in the early 2000s became the site of continuous, detailed, passionate debate about which show was better and why. This debate had a specific character. It was not merely about entertainment preference, but about values, about what kind of comedy deserved to be called sophisticated, about whether narrative structure was necessary for comedy to have genuine worth. These are not trivial questions, and the people having them were engaging at a level that rivaled academic discussion of the same issues. As social media emerged, the debate moved platforms, but retained its essential character. Reddit's Simpsons and Family Guy communities developed distinct cultures, reflecting the underlying disagreement. The Simpsons community tends to be more analytical, more invested in episode rankings and golden age discourse, more focused on the relationship between quality and longevity. The Family Guy community tends to be more interested in sharing individual moments, the gags and cutaways that work as standalone entertainment, and less concerned with the overall arc of the show's quality over time. Both bodies of discussion confirm that these are not trivial shows. They are not simple entertainment. They are complicated, contradictory, historically important pieces of American television comedy that have shaped the culture around them in ways extending far beyond the Sunday night schedule they share. And eventually, the argument between them was given a direct test, a test that no amount of forum debate had managed to provide, when the two shows were finally placed in the same episode. Section 8. The crossover episode, 44 minutes when two worlds collided. September 28, 2014. Fox, 44 minutes. 44 minutes that had been anticipated, speculated about, demanded by fans, and dreaded by critics for the better part of a decade before they finally arrived. The Simpsons Guy, an episode title doing triple duty as the name of the Family Guy episode, a reference to the most famous Simpsons catchphrase, and a statement about where the story was centered, premiered as the 13th season opener for Family Guy and drew over 9 million viewers. It was the most watched episode of Family Guy in years, which tells you something about the power of this particular cultural moment, regardless of what the episode's eventual critical reception would be. The idea was proposed by Family Guy executive producer Richard Appel, whose background made him uniquely suited for the project. Before joining Family Guy, Appel had been a writer on The Simpsons. He knew both shows from the inside, understood what made each one work and what each one's characters required, and could see a version of a crossover that respected both. He brought the concept to both creative teams. After years of the two shows exchanging coded jabs, there was enough mutual curiosity and perhaps enough shared awareness that this was something the audience genuinely wanted to attempt it. McFarlane articulated his philosophy for the episode clearly in promotional interviews. The key to any good crossover is character interaction, not plot. The story exists to put specific people in contact with each other. What matters is what those people say and do when they're together. Groening said he wanted to see Homer and Peter together. That was the heart of it. Everything else was context. Patrick Megan wrote the episode and Peter Shin directed it. Shin's background was uniquely relevant. He had been a layout artist on The Simpsons before moving to Family Guy, and he understood both visual languages from the inside. He spent significant time working out how to accommodate the Griffins within Springfield's aesthetic, adjusting the Griffin family's design so they wouldn't look out of place, including dimming the whites of their eyes, so the contrast wasn't too jarring against Springfield's more yellowed palette. These adjustments were gestures of visual respect, acknowledgments that the two shows had developed distinct visual grammars that needed to be reconciled thoughtfully. The plot, in brief: Peter Griffin, annoyed by an unfunny newspaper comic strip, creates his own. His strips initially succeed but then become offensive. They make a joke about domestic violence that generates an internet controversy. A mob forms outside the Griffin home. The family flees. Their car is stolen while they stop for gas outside a town called Springfield. They wander to the Quick E-Mart. Homer Simpson introduces himself and buys them donuts. He invites them home. The Simpsons put the Griffins up while they wait for their car to return. From there, the character pairings that the episode was always really about begin to develop. Homer and Peter bond immediately over beer, specifically over their respective favorite brands. Homer's Duff and Peter's Pawtucket Patriot Ale. The bonding is warm and genuine. Two men who drink the same category of thing, who approach the world with the same cheerful incompetence, who recognize in each other a version of what they themselves are, however much the specific versions differ. They go looking for Peter's stolen car together, which leads eventually to the discovery that Pawtucket Patriot Ale, Peter's beloved drink, is an unauthorized copy of Duff beer. This discovery is the pivot on which the episode's second half turns, and it is the most directly self-referential moment in a deeply self-referential episode. When lawyers argue in court that Pawtucket Patriot is a cheap knockoff of Duff, they are saying in the most direct possible way exactly what Simpsons fans have been saying about Family Guy since 1999. The allegory is inescapable and entirely intentional. The writers chose to put the accusation of plagiarism at the center of the crossover episode's legal conflict because they knew that acknowledging the accusation was more interesting than ignoring it, that making it the episode's explicit subject was both funnier and more honest than pretending it didn't exist. Fred Flintstone appears as the judge, the original animated sitcom patriarch, the character from whom both Homer and Peter are in some sense descended, the source of the tradition both shows are participating in. His ruling that both Duff and Pawtucket Patriot are copies of his own Budrick, and therefore the lawsuit is dismissed, is the episode's most genuinely clever moment. It places both shows in a long tradition of derivation and influence. The Flintstones came before The Simpsons came before Family Guy, and the concept of originality in American animated family comedy has always been somewhat illusory. Nobody is entirely original. Everyone borrowed from everyone who came before. The question is not whether you borrowed, but what you did with what you took. The Bart and Stewie pairing is perhaps the most thoughtfully constructed of the episode's character combinations. Stewie initially idolizes Bart, seeing in him a kindred spirit, a boy who rejects authority, who approaches the world as something to be subverted rather than obeyed. He trades his mind control device for Bart's slingshot, a transaction that makes immediate emotional sense. Stewie wants a physical tool for creating real-world chaos, not a technological one for creating control. But the more time Stewie and Bart spend together, the more the fundamental difference between their approaches to mischief becomes visible. When Stewie decides to help Bart by dealing with his enemies, he does not do what Bart does. He kidnaps them. He subjects them to psychological operations that are several steps beyond anything Bart has ever contemplated. He approaches the project with the methodical precision of someone who has been building weapons in a crib and plotting his mother's murder since before he could walk. Bart is disturbed by what Stewie is capable of. The episode is honest about why. "I thought you were like me," Bart says, and Stewie's response is the most honest thing in the episode. He is like Bart, just further along the spectrum than Bart was willing to go. Bart's mischief is fundamentally benign. It is the mischief of a child asserting himself against a world that will eventually claim him, performed without malice and without real victims. Stewie's mischief, in its original form, was something genuinely different. The calculated cruelty of a mind that did not accept human ethical constraints as binding. When Bart sees that clearly, he retreats. And when the Griffins leave Springfield at the episode's end, Stewie sits at a school chalkboard writing, "I will not think about Bart," over and over while crying, which is the episode's most emotionally honest and most affecting moment. The Lisa and Meg pairing works at a lower volume, but carries its own quiet weight. Lisa, who knows what it is to be the one sensitive and capable girl in a family and a town that cannot fully accommodate her, recognizes something in Meg that the rest of the Simpsons and most of the Griffins have missed. Genuine capability. She teaches Meg the saxophone. Meg is, to everyone's surprise, quite good. For any viewer who has spent years watching Meg, absorb relentless abuse from her family, watching Lisa treat her with basic human kindness and intellectual respect is unexpectedly affecting. Marge and Lois get considerably less screen time than the other pairings, which is one of the episode's genuine weaknesses. Both women deserve more. Their conversation at the Simpson home is brief and somewhat perfunctory, acknowledging their shared situation, the long-suffering wives of catastrophically impulsive men, without genuinely exploring what each of them has become through years of managing that situation. It is a missed opportunity that critics who noted it were right to identify. The 8-minute fight sequence between Homer and Peter is the episode's centerpiece and its most technically impressive achievement. Peter Shin reportedly spent enormous amounts of time choreographing and animating this sequence, which moves through multiple Springfield locations, references Homer's famous gorge jumping from the Season 2 episode Bart the Daredevil, and escalates to outer space aboard the alien craft belonging to Kang and Kodos, before resolving in a ruined Springfield street where both men can finally stop. The fight was designed to invoke Family Guy's signature combat sequence, the recurring battles between Peter and the giant chicken, while giving Homer enough to do that the sequence felt fair and mutual. The comedy comes partly from the fight itself and partly from a visible friction between the Homer the audience knows and the context he has been placed in. Homer's show has rules about what happens to Homer. Family Guy has different rules. Bringing Homer into a Family Guy fight sequence and subjecting him to Family Guy rules creates a discomfort that the episode neither hides nor fully resolves. The discomfort is honest. These are different shows with different rules, and putting the characters together does not make the rules the same. The resolution is what the episode had earned rather than what it had dramatically built to. Peter apologizes. Homer accepts it. They agree to exist in the same schedule with half an hour of programming between them, and a pile of garbage marking the border. It is a joke, and it is also completely true. These two shows need the space between them. The difference is what makes each of them what they are. Critical response to the episode was mixed in ways that reflected the pre-existing positions of the critics more than any objective assessment. Fans of both shows, people who could watch the episode without needing it to prove something about which show was superior, found it largely satisfying. Its IMDb rating of 8.4 out of 10 reflects a large, engaged audience that felt the crossover delivered on its central promise. Critics were more divided. Some praised the episode's self-awareness and the genuine warmth of the Homer-Peter dynamic. Others found it too long, too uneven, and too willing to import Family Guy's darkest instincts. Particularly a joke involving Stewie at Moe's bar that referenced sexual assault and generated significant controversy before and after the episode aired. That controversy was, in its own way, the crossover's most honest moment. It demonstrated more clearly than any critical review the fundamental difference between these two shows and what each is willing to do. The Simpsons has always been edgy by family television standards, but there are places it will not go. Family Guy has always defined itself partly by its willingness to go exactly those places. Putting the two shows together made those different thresholds visible in ways that could not be papered over. The crossover episode confirmed rather than revealed. It confirmed that the two shows were different enough that bringing them together created friction as well as harmony. It confirmed that the Griffins and the Simpsons recognized each other but could not fully inhabit each other's world. And it confirmed that the argument about which show was better was never really the right question, because the shows were not trying to do the same thing. Section 9. Legacy Moments. The scenes that live forever in memory. There is something telling about the different ways fans of these two shows describe their most cherished memories from them. The difference in the descriptions is itself evidence for the argument each show makes about comedy, and it tracks so consistently that you can usually tell which show someone grew up with just from how they talk about their favorite moments. When Simpsons fans describe the scenes they love most, they describe feelings wrapped in comedy. The scene in Bart Gets an F where Bart, who has been genuinely studying for the first time in his life, and who faces failure anyway, looks out the classroom window at unexpected snow that has canceled the day, bursts into tears of relief that embarrass him in front of his teacher, and then impulsively kisses her cheek before running out the door. The scene does not announce itself. It arrives in the middle of an episode about academic failure and lands with the force of something true about a specific kind of overwhelmed gratitude. The feeling of being saved from something by luck you did not deserve, and being so overwhelmed by relief that your own emotional response surprises you. The moment in One Fish, Two Fish, Blowfish, Bluefish, where Homer, on what he believes is the last night of his life, stays up through all the dark hours listening to jazz and waiting for sunrise, and the episode holds on him long enough that you feel the weight of everything he wants, that the music is momentarily allowing him to have. The comedy of the episode has built to this moment, has accumulated through Homer's fumbling, imperfect attempts to do right by his family in his final hours, and this quiet moment, this man alone with music and mortality, is what the comedy was always building toward. The scene at the end of Lisa's Substitute, where the note from her departing teacher says things about her that nobody in her daily life has ever said, that her isolation is the loneliness of someone ahead of her time, that the world around her will catch up, and the camera holds on Lisa reading it, and Yeardley Smith's face and the silence. These moments work because the show built everything around them carefully enough to make them possible. The comedy is what makes the feeling credible. The feeling is what makes the comedy matter. The opening of The Last Temptation of Homer, where Homer sees a beautiful new coworker and feels the particular terror of someone who is deeply committed to his marriage and equally deeply aware that his commitment is about to be tested. The episode's comedy comes from Homer's desperate, absurd, ultimately touching attempts to resist temptation through every means available to him, including consulting Barney, which is never a good sign. But the setup is quietly serious. This is a man who loves his wife and knows he is not a saint, and the episode respects both facts without resolving the tension cheaply. Sideshow Bob encountering rake after rake in Cape Fear, in a sequence that lasts considerably longer than any conventional comedy timing would suggest, and gets funnier with every additional rake precisely because it continues past the point where you thought it would stop. This is Family Guy's approach, the commitment to the bit past all reasonable duration, deployed in a Simpsons context, and the fact that it works, as well as it does there, is evidence that the technique is not inherently a lesser approach, just a different one. When Family Guy fans describe their favorite moments, the vocabulary is genuinely different. They describe specific gags. The Conway Twitty running joke, in which instead of a joke, the show cuts to a full, unedited Conway Twitty music video, not a clip, but a full performance, with no punchline and no twist. Just Conway Twitty performing until the music ends and the episode resumes. The first time it appeared, it was shocking. The second time, it was bizarre. By the fourth or fifth appearance, it had become something almost avant-garde in its commitment to non-comedy. A joke whose content was the refusal to be funny in any conventional sense. Fans who love this gag are loving it as a statement about comedy itself, as the show taking its own excess to a logical extreme and daring the audience to find it funny. For a certain kind of viewer, it works. For others, it is the clearest example of what critics most disliked about the show. Both responses are completely coherent. The giant chicken fights are the most extended and most beloved example of Family Guy's willingness to commit to a bit past all reasonable duration. The first fight appeared in a Season 2 episode when Peter's attempt to use a coupon from a giant chicken turns violent. What began as a brief comedic conflict escalated into a several-minute battle that destroyed much of the surrounding area before both combatants departed. The fights have returned across multiple seasons, each time more elaborate and more extensive. Each time lasting long enough that they become something between a comedy sequence and a sustained performance. The comedy does not come from jokes within the fight. It comes from the fight's existence as a recurring institution within Peter Griffin's life, from the show's deadpan insistence that these extraordinary, property-destroying battles are simply a feature of the world, something Peter moves through and returns from without needing to explain. The Road to Rhode Island episode, which opened the second season and introduced the road trip format that would become one of the show's signature structures, is frequently cited as the moment Family Guy found something distinctively its own. The episode sends Brian and Stewie across America together, and the chemistry between Seth MacFarlane's two characters, the cynical dog intellectual and the baby evil genius, finding an unlikely friendship through forced proximity, was the beginning of the show's most consistent source of genuine quality. The road trip episodes that followed, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the North Pole are among the most consistently praised entries in the entire Family Guy catalog. And they work because they commit fully to the Brian and Stewie dynamic rather than relying primarily on cutaway gags to carry the comedy. Among the moments that exist at the intersection of the two shows' history with each other, the crossover episode produced several that have already passed into the shared memory of both shows' overlapping fan communities. The courtroom scene, with characters from both shows seated on opposite sides while Fred Flintstone presides as judge, is visually extraordinary for animation fans. Seeing these characters in the same frame, characters that existed in separate universes for 15 years, produces a kind of impossible made real satisfaction that no amount of critical distance can fully diminish. The choice of Fred Flintstone as judge is one of the episode's most intelligent creative decisions. It acknowledges the full chain of influence. The Flintstones came before The Simpsons, which came before Family Guy, and all of them share a tradition that is, in some sense, a series of creative inheritances. Nobody is entirely original. Everyone owes something to what came before. Stewie at the chalkboard at the episode's end is the moment that the crossover actually earns emotionally. After Bart's rejection, after the discovery that Stewie's version of mischief is too extreme even for someone who seemed to share his sensibility, Stewie sits writing "I will not think about Bart" in neat letters, over and over, while clearly thinking about nothing but Bart and crying while he does it. The scene is played without irony and without a conventional punchline. It is simply sad. It is simply true. It tells you something about Stewie that the show has never quite admitted directly. That beneath all the intelligence and the weaponry and the schemes, he is desperately lonely in a way that his extraordinary capabilities have made worse rather than better. The crossover gave him the possibility of connection with someone who seemed to understand him, and then took it away because what he has turned out to be too much. The Quagmire speech from the Family Guy episode, "Jerome is the new black," deserves mention in any accounting of moments that exist at the intersection of the show's histories with quality character work. In that episode, Quagmire tells Brian, at length and with impressive precision, exactly what is wrong with him. The pretension, the hypocrisy, the gap between Brian's self-image as an intellectual and moral exemplar and his actual behavior toward the people around him. Every accusation Quagmire makes is backed by things the show has actually depicted. The scene is 2 minutes of pure character work, with no gags, no diversions, no cutaways. It is Family Guy demonstrating that it is capable of exactly the thing its critics most often say it cannot do, and it is one of the most widely discussed moments in the show's history, precisely because of that demonstration. Both shows, at their best, are capable of moments that stay with you. The difference is in the frequency and the mechanism. The Simpsons at its best produced them regularly and through craft, through the patient construction of context that made the moment possible. Family Guy produced them less predictably and sometimes accidentally, through the sheer volume of material the show generated, finding its way to something true. But both shows produced them, and the people who love each show love it for the moments that got through. The Season 8 Family Guy episode, Brian and Stewie, the bottle episode in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the whole episode just talking, stands as the most powerful single piece of evidence that Family Guy could do everything its critics said it could not do. The episode has no cutaways. It has almost no conventional comedy. It is simply two characters being real with each other, and Brian's revelation that he keeps a gun, not primarily for self-defense, but for the moments when his life feels not worth continuing, is rendered with a vulnerability and seriousness that the show had never attempted in quite this way before. The episode became one of the most widely praised in the show's history, precisely because it demonstrated a range that the show had rarely exercised. The tragedy is not that Family Guy couldn't produce work of this quality. The tragedy is that it chose not to more often. Section 10. The Long Game. 35 years of staying alive. Every show that runs long enough eventually becomes the best available argument against its own continuation. There is a point in the life of any long-running comedy where the writers have told every story they originally intended to tell, where the characters have developed as far as the premise will allow, and where the choice presents itself: end and preserve the legacy intact, or continue and risk what has been built. Both The Simpsons and Family Guy chose to continue. Both face the consequences of that choice. Both have also demonstrated, at various points in their extended runs, that those consequences are not always or only negative. That long-running shows can still produce work that surprises, that characters can still find new registers in their 40th or 60th or 100th season, that the audience's familiarity with a world and its people can itself become a creative resource rather than merely a creative constraint. The Simpsons' decline is the most analyzed creative deterioration in the history of American television comedy. The passion with which fans discuss it, the specific episodes cited as turning points, the specific creative decisions identified as betrayals, the specific writers who departed, and the specific qualities that departed with them, suggests that the decline was experienced not merely as a drop in quality, but as something more personal. The show that had been a genuine companion through the 1990s, that had understood the texture of a specific cultural moment with rare honesty, became something else over time. The characters got louder and more cartoonish. The emotional grace notes that used to feel earned started to feel manufactured. The jokes that used to grow from who these people were started to feel imported from outside. The commonly cited turning point is somewhere between Season 8 and Season 12. Season 9's The Principal and the Pauper is most frequently mentioned as a specific instance of the show breaking faith with its own accumulated history. The episode revealed that Principal Skinner's entire identity was fiction, that the man the audience had known for 9 years was actually someone named Armin Tamzarian, who had assumed another man's identity. The episode was not badly executed. What appalled fans was its casual willingness to discard years of character history in service of a single episode's premise. The implicit message that none of the show's history was actually sacred, that anything could be undone at any time, was devastating to the audience's sense of investment. Sam Simon had left after Season 4, taking with him the structural discipline and character-first philosophy he had brought to the early writing room. Conan O'Brien left for late night. John Swartzwelder gradually withdrew from the room and eventually stopped writing scripts entirely, eventually publishing a series of comic novels whose style is immediately recognizable to anyone who knows his Simpsons work. The culture of the room shifted as these voices departed. The instinct for the unexpected emotional grace note became harder to find. Not gone, but less reliable. And yet The Simpsons never fully stopped producing good television. The best episodes of the later seasons demonstrate real quality, real craft, real engagement with what the show could do. The Simpsons movie in 2007, while regarded by purists with varying degrees of warmth, was a legitimately entertaining piece of animation with genuine emotional resonance and a sense of occasion that the show had struggled to produce in individual episodes for years. In the show's 33rd and 34th seasons, critics began noting what appeared to be a genuine creative improvement, suggesting that even 35 years in, the show retained the capacity to surprise people who had given up expecting it to. Family Guy's arc is more dramatic in a specific way. It actually went away. The show was canceled by Fox after its 3rd season in 2002. In television, cancellation is normally the end of the story, but the DVD sets of Family Guy's first 2 seasons sold over 400,000 copies, an extraordinary number for a canceled cartoon. When Cartoon Network's Adult Swim acquired the reruns cheaply because nobody thought the show was worth much anymore, the ratings were unexpectedly enormous. Adult Swim's viewership jumped 239% when Family Guy began airing. Fox took notice. In 2004, new episodes were ordered. In 2005, the show returned. The 3-year gap had consequences. The writers who had dispersed during the hiatus did not all return. The tonal consistency of the first 3 seasons was harder to maintain with a partially reconstituted team. The show returned into a media landscape that had changed significantly. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year as Family Guy's revival, and the emergence of video sharing changed how the show's content was consumed. Individual Family Guy cutaway gags could now be clipped and shared virally, which meant the show was increasingly experienced as a collection of individual moments rather than as coherent half-hour episodes. The writing room responded, consciously or not, by producing more of those shareable moments at the expense of the story structure that connected them. Seth MacFarlane himself stepped back from the day-to-day creative oversight of Family Guy around 2011, handing showrunning duties to others while pursuing an expanding portfolio of projects. The feature film Ted, which grossed over $500 million worldwide, A Million Ways to Die in the West, The Orville, the science fiction series he created and starred in for Fox and then Hulu, and multiple music albums drawing on his passion for big band and orchestral pop. He continued to voice his characters, which meant he was present in the recording booth for every episode, but the hands-on creative authority he had exercised in the early years was no longer his primary role. The effect of this withdrawal on the show's quality is debated among fans and critics. Some argue that the show's decline in the middle seasons was primarily a consequence of MacFarlane's stepping back, that his instincts about what the show should and should not do had been the safeguard preventing the worst excesses, and that in his absence those excesses accumulated unchecked. Others argue that the decline was already underway and that MacFarlane's departure was a symptom rather than a cause, that any show running as long as Family Guy had been would face the same creative fatigue regardless of who was steering. The truth is probably somewhere in the complicated middle of those two positions. Both shows were renewed in major deals extending their runs into the late 2020s. The Simpsons has been picked up through its 37th season. Family Guy secured a deal in 2025 covering it through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. These renewals are business decisions before they are creative ones. Both shows generate enormous value through streaming rights, licensing, merchandise, and brand recognition that newer shows cannot replicate. The economics justify continuation regardless of whether the creative quality does. Both shows have become, at this stage of their lives, brands as much as they are creative endeavors, and the tension between those two identities is something both have had to navigate in different ways. What both shows have in common, across their very different histories, is that they were built to last in ways that are only visible in retrospect. They created fictional worlds rich enough to sustain decades of storytelling, even when the storytelling itself was uneven. They established characters iconic enough to remain culturally recognizable even when individual episodes failed those characters. They generated the kind of deep audience investment that has no single cause, but that, once established, is extraordinarily difficult to extinguish. 35 years and 30 years, respectively. Longer than most marriages. Longer than many careers. Longer than the childhoods of people who are now parents themselves, introducing these shows to their own children. Both shows have outlasted the cultural moments that made them and entered something else. Something more like permanence, more like institution, more like the kind of thing that exists because it has always existed, and it is difficult to imagine it not existing. Section 11. Fan Wars. The debates that live on every platform. The internet created something neither show specifically anticipated. A permanent, participatory audience with strong opinions about every individual episode, every character decision, and every creative choice, and willing to share those opinions at extraordinary length and with considerable passion. The Family Guy versus Simpsons debate online is one of the oldest continuous arguments in the history of television discussion on the internet. It began on message boards in the early 2000s, and it has never entirely stopped. The most persistent argument in favor of The Simpsons centers on the golden years. Simpsons defenders will point to specific episodes and argue that what was achieved in those years represents a level of creative accomplishment that animated television has never replicated. Marge versus the Monorail is often cited as the single best episode in television history by serious fans of the show. Written by Conan O'Brien and featuring Phil Hartman as the irresistible con man, Lyle Lanley, the episode is comedy as architecture. Every element in exactly the right place, every joke calibrated precisely, every character behaving in ways that are both absurd and entirely consistent with who they are. The Hartman performance is the best guest appearance in the show's history, and the satirical point about the relationship between charisma and competence is made without ever feeling like a lecture. You Only Move Twice is equally cited by fans who want to point to the episode that demonstrates what the show was capable of in its prime. Albert Brooks as Hank Scorpio, the most cheerful and genuinely effective supervillain imaginable, is one of the great guest performances in the history of American television. The episode works because it commits fully to its absurd premise. What if a Bond villain was also a genuinely supportive and encouraging boss? And finds in that premise both comedy and genuine emotional truth about what Homer has been missing all his working life. The moment when Scorpio offers Homer the Denver Broncos as a parting gift, and Homer says he was more of a Dallas Cowboys guy, and Scorpio quietly says he'll work on that, is one of those moments where a Simpsons joke does several things simultaneously and makes all of them look effortless. Cape Fear is often cited as the funniest 30 minutes the show ever produced, built around Kelsey Grammer's sideshow Bob, a recurring villain who carries more genuine menace and more genuine pathos than almost any other character in the show's history. And climaxing in the rake sequence in which Bob steps on rake after rake in extended succession, the joke getting funnier with each repetition, not despite its length, but because of it. That episode is also the clearest proof that the commitment to the bit approach that defines Family Guy's best moments is not inherently inferior to story-driven comedy. It just requires the same level of craft and precision deployed differently. The most persistent argument in favor of Family Guy centers on accessibility and pure entertainment. Family Guy defenders will point to the show's extraordinary reach on social media and video platforms, where individual Family Guy gags have been shared and reshared so many times that they function almost as cultural reference points in their own right, independent of the show, independent of context, existing as standalone pieces of comic content. The chicken fights, Quagmire's reaction to certain situations, Stewie's various expressions of contempt and ambition, Brian's literary pretensions colliding with his actual output. These things have escaped the show and become part of the ambient culture of internet humor in ways that The Simpsons' golden age, for all its artistic superiority, never quite achieved in the social media era. Family Guy defenders will also point to the show's genuine range when it chooses to exercise it. The Brian and Stewie bottle episode is evidence of what the show can do when it commits to character over gag. The Road to Episodes is evidence that the show has its own distinctive strengths, independent of the cutaway format. The Quagmire speech as evidence that the characters have genuine psychological depth that the show can access when it wants to. The argument is not that Family Guy is always great. The argument is that it is great in its own specific ways, and that dismissing it because those ways are different from The Simpsons' ways reflects a failure to engage with what Family Guy was actually trying to do. Both arguments have genuine merit. Both say something true about what these shows are and what they do. The argument that The Simpsons at its best was a greater artistic achievement than Family Guy at its best is defensible and probably correct, in the sense that the best Simpsons episodes achieve things that the best Family Guy episodes do not. The argument that Family Guy delivers consistent entertainment value in a form that enormous numbers of people find genuinely satisfying is also defensible and correct in the sense that the show does what it does with remarkable efficiency and consistency. These arguments are not actually in conflict with each other. They describe different shows valued for different reasons. And the people having these arguments, with the passion and the specificity and the detailed episode knowledge that characterizes the most committed participants in these debates, those people are the best evidence of both shows' success. You do not argue this passionately about things you don't care about. You argue this passionately about things that meant something to you, that were there for you at a specific time in your life, that occupied space in your emotional landscape that other things did not. The crossover episode generated discussion at a scale unusual even for these two always debated shows. Every character pairing was analyzed. Every meta-joke was decoded. The question of whether Homer or Peter won their fight was debated, with the seriousness usually reserved for sporting events. The question of whether the episode had treated both shows' characters faithfully, whether the Simpsons characters had been respected, whether the Griffin family had been accurately represented, generated the kind of passionate, specific, detailed argument that these shows always generate when something happens that touches the core of what people love about them. The level of engagement is the most important thing. People do not build encyclopedic wikis and conduct decades-long forum arguments about things they are indifferent to. The intensity of the fan communities around both shows is evidence of how genuinely those shows connected with their audiences, how much real emotional and intellectual investment millions of people made in these fictional worlds and these animated characters. That connection is what makes the debate so persistent and so personal. It is what has kept both shows relevant across decades of changing media landscapes, changing cultural contexts, and changing audience expectations. The debate will not be resolved. It never will be. That is not a failure of the debate, but a feature of it. Evidence that both shows have earned the kind of devotion that doesn't require resolution, that exists happily in a state of ongoing, loving, sometimes infuriated engagement with the things it cares about. Section 12. Final verdict and closing. What it all means. There is no clean answer to the question of which show is better. There has never been one, and there will never be one. And anyone who tells you otherwise is working from a definition of better that privileges some values over others. Values that are not universal. Values that reflect what one particular person wants from comedy, rather than what comedy objectively should be. If you believe comedy should primarily produce laughter, measured by volume and frequency, Family Guy at its most efficient has a case. If you believe comedy should primarily produce understanding of ourselves, of the families we came from and the ones we built, of the country we all somehow share, The Simpsons at its peak has a case that is harder to argue against. If you believe both things, and most people who love comedy believe both things in different proportions at different times, then both shows have given you something real across their combined history of roughly 1,000 episodes. What seems clear, looking at both shows honestly and fully across their entire histories, is that they are different enough to be genuinely complementary rather than genuinely competitive. The argument that one is definitively superior assumes they are trying to do the same thing, and they are not. They have always been trying to do neighboring things, to make the same kind of audience laugh in the same time slot on the same network. But the philosophy behind the comedy, the approach to character and story and structure has always been fundamentally different. Their best moments are incomparable to each other, not because one is superior, but because they are calibrated for different kinds of experience, and they produce different kinds of pleasure. What they share, beyond the structural similarities that made the comparison inevitable from the first episode of Family Guy onward, is a commitment to the idea that the ordinary American family, flawed, loud, loving in its clumsy way, perpetually failing to become what it wants to be, is worth making comedy about. Both shows looked at a family that television had previously either idealized beyond recognition or ignored entirely and said, "These people are funny. Their struggles are funny. Their love for each other, expressed with such consistent imperfection, is funny. Their failure to become the people they want to be is funny. These flawed, ordinary, sometimes impossible people are worth your time." That commitment is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the thing that made both shows possible in the first place. The thing that found them their audiences and held those audiences through decades of uneven quality and changing media landscapes and every other obstacle that should have ended them long before now. People keep watching because they keep recognizing something. In Homer's frustrated intelligence and Peter's warm-hearted obliviousness. In Marge's patient love and Lois's pragmatic acceptance. In Bart's cheerful rebellion and Stewie's extraordinary loneliness. In Lisa's principled isolation and Meg's quiet dignity under sustained pressure. In all of these people across both shows, audiences have been finding versions of things they recognize in themselves and in the people they love. That recognition is the oldest kind of comedy. It is the kind that goes back further than television, further than film, all the way back to the earliest human communities that gathered around fires to make each other laugh at themselves. We have always made comedy about the family we were born into and the family we chose and the family we ended up with, regardless of what we planned. We have always found in the gap between who we wanted to be and who we actually were something that was simultaneously painful and hilarious. Both of these shows, in their different ways, participated in that ancient human tradition, and both of them did it in ways that earned the love they received. The crossover episode gave us one final image that might be the most honest frame for the whole relationship. Homer and Peter standing in the ruins of their fight, making peace. Peter apologizes. Homer accepts it. They agree to exist in the same schedule with half an hour of programming between them and a pile of garbage marking the border. It is a joke, and it is also completely true. These two shows need the space between them. The difference is what makes each of them what they are. Close the gap and you lose something from both. Leave the garbage there. Keep the half hour between them. Watch both on the nights when you have the time for the different things they do for you. One of them will make you feel something. One of them will make you laugh so fast you won't know where it came from. On the very best nights, both of those things will happen in the same 30 minutes. That is more than most things offer. And if you have made it all the way here, if you have been with this thing from the beginning, through all 12 sections, through Springfield and Quahog and every character and every comparison and the crossover and everything that led up to it and everything that followed from it, then you are exactly the person this channel was built for. You are someone who wants to understand the things they love, not just watch them. Someone who wants to know where they came from and what makes them work, and what the argument about them actually means. That kind of person makes this channel worth making. Drop a like if you got something from this. Subscribe if you want more. And leave a comment telling me which of these two shows you grew up with, which one you still go back to, and which single moment from either world has stayed with you the longest. I read every single one. Sleep well. These stories will still be here when you wake up. End of script. Estimated running time at standard narration. Pace, approximately 2 hours 30 minutes to 3 hours. Expansion A. The writing rooms, where the shows were really made. To understand why these two shows feel so different to watch, you have to go deeper than the characters and the settings and even the philosophy of the humor. You have to go into the actual rooms where the comedy was made, the writers' rooms, which in the television industry are where the real work happens, and where the real character of a show is established and maintained and eventually, over time, changed. The Simpsons writers' room in its golden years is one of the most studied creative environments in the history of American entertainment, and for good reason. The people who assembled there in the early 1990s represented an unusual concentration of talent that is almost impossible to replicate under ordinary circumstances. These were writers who had often come from comedy backgrounds that prized exactly the kind of intellectual rigor and structural sophistication that Sam Simon had brought to the early show. Writers who understood that a great joke was not just something funny, but something that was funny in a specific way. That the best version of any joke was the most precisely constructed version. And that the difference between a good joke and a great one was often invisible to the audience, but entirely apparent to the people in the room. The process was demanding in ways that multiple participants have described, with a mixture of admiration and genuine horror. Every script went through multiple rewrites. Every joke was tested against the room, argued over, revised, often discarded and rebuilt from scratch. George Meyer, one of the most respected and influential writers in the show's history, had a reputation for pushing every joke to its absolute limit, for insisting on finding the funniest possible version of every moment, refusing to accept something merely good when something brilliant was potentially available. This standard produced an extraordinary body of work. It also produced an environment that some writers found genuinely punishing. Conan O'Brien, who joined the show in 1991 and worked there until 1993 before leaving for late night, has spoken at length about the experience of writing for The Simpsons in those years. The speed at which jokes were generated and discarded, the unrelenting search for the perfect version of every scene, the specific pleasure of being in a room full of people who were all trying their absolute hardest to be as funny as they possibly could. All of this shaped O'Brien's understanding of what comedy writing could be at its best. His own episode, Marge versus the Monorail, written during his time on the show, is widely regarded as the single best episode the show produced, which is a remarkable achievement for someone who was at that point in his late 20s and relatively early in his professional career. John Swartzwelder's approach was different from everyone else's in the room, which is partly why his work was so distinctive. He worked primarily alone, writing full scripts and submitting them, rather than participating extensively in the group rewriting process. His voice is immediately recognizable in his episodes, a kind of deadpan absurdism that treated the most extreme premises with complete sincerity, and that found comedy in the precise gap between the ridiculousness of what was happening and the total normality with which everyone in the episode responded to it. He wrote dozens of episodes across the show's golden years and is responsible for some of its most beloved moments, including the entirety of You Only Move Twice, the monorail episode, which he co-wrote, and dozens of other episodes that fans cite as among the best the show has ever produced. Swartzwelder eventually stopped writing for the show and moved to rural seclusion, where he began writing a series of comic novels featuring a character named Frank Burley, a mediocre private detective that have found devoted readerships among people who recognized the specific flavor of his Simpsons work in his prose. These novels, with titles like Who Shot Rudy Valentine and The Exploding Detective and The Time Machine Did It, are among the funniest and most underread books in American popular fiction, and reading them is the closest thing available to experiencing what Swartzwelder's Simpsons episodes felt like from the inside. The Family Guy writer's room has been a different kind of environment, more chaotic in some ways, more hierarchical in others, and significantly different in what it valued in a joke and what it was willing to accept as the minimum standard for inclusion in an episode. The room under McFarlane's active supervision in the early years had a specific energy that reflected his own approach. Fast, reference-heavy, willing to try almost anything, less concerned with whether a joke built on the ones around it, and more concerned with whether it was funny on its own terms right now. The diversity of the early Family Guy writing room is worth noting. McFarlane assembled writers with different backgrounds and different comic sensibilities, and the early season's relative freshness and variety reflect that diversity. The challenge for the room became maintaining that diversity as the show's aesthetic became more established, as the cutaway format became more dominant, and as the incentive structure of viral internet sharing began to push the writing in specific directions. Writers who came to Family Guy from other shows often reported a significant adjustment in how they thought about constructing a scene. The question in a Simpsons room was something like, what is the funniest thing that could happen to this character in this situation, given everything we know about who they are and what they want? The question in a Family Guy room was often something more like, what is the funniest thing that could happen, period, regardless of whether it connects to the situation or the character? Both questions can produce great comedy, but they produce very different kinds of great comedy, and the kinds they produce require different skills and different instincts. The Writers Guild strike of 2007 and 2008 affected both shows, though in different ways. The strike lasted from November 2007 to February 2008 and disrupted production across all scripted television. McFarlane, who had been an advocate for the Writers Guild in previous labor actions, joined the picket lines and made clear that his shows would not continue production during the strike. Family Guy's Season 6 was shortened as a result, and the disruption to the production schedule had lasting effects on the creative rhythm of the show. Some writers who had been with the room moved on during the hiatus and did not return. The show that resumed after the strike was slightly different from the show that had stopped. The Simpsons, similarly, dealt with significant production disruptions and contract renegotiations across its long history, including a famous impasse in the early 2000s in which Fox proposed significant pay cuts for the principal voice cast, which responded with the implicit threat of collective action. The negotiations resolved in a way that kept the show going, but the episode, which received considerable public attention at the time, illustrated how many stakeholders and how much financial complexity surrounded a show that had been running for over 2 decades. Both writing rooms also had to navigate the specific challenge of writing for characters whose parameters had been established by years of previous episodes, but whose situations needed to feel fresh. The Simpsons dealt with this more successfully in its golden years by simply being willing to put characters in genuinely new situations and find the comedy in the specific texture of those situations. Family Guy dealt with it partly by having the characters do genuinely new things in the main plot, while the cutaway gags provided variety that was entirely independent of the characters' histories. Both approaches have their advantages. The Simpsons approach requires maintaining the integrity of who the characters are across many seasons of episodes, which becomes increasingly difficult as the accumulated history becomes more constraining. The Family Guy approach allows more variety in the moment, but at the cost of the emotional depth that comes from sustained engagement with who the characters actually are. Expansion B, the voice actors and what they brought. One of the most consistently underappreciated aspects of both shows' success is the specific work done by their principal voice casts, the actors who have spent decades inhabiting these characters, and whose performances are so deeply embedded in the audience's experience of the shows that they are essentially invisible. You do not think about Dan Castellaneta's voice when you are watching Homer Simpson. You think about Homer. The voice has dissolved into the character so completely that the character and the performance have become the same thing. Dan Castellaneta has been Homer Simpson since 1987, longer than many of the show's fans have been alive. The specific quality of Castellaneta's Homer, the way the voice communicates both stupidity and genuine feeling, the way his dough, which was officially added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001, manages to be both a comic sound effect and a genuine expression of a specific emotional state, is the result of decades of careful, attentive performance work that gets very little attention compared to the writing or the animation. Castellaneta has also voiced dozens of other characters on the show across its history, including Grandpa Simpson, Sideshow Mel, Mayor Quimby, and many others, demonstrating a vocal range that is genuinely extraordinary. Julie Kavner as Marge Simpson has been discussed at some length already, but it is worth returning to the specific quality of her performance because it is so central to what makes Marge work as a character. The hoarseness of Kavner's speaking voice, a quality that was present before she began the role and has become more pronounced over the decades, is both a limitation and a defining characteristic. It is what gives Marge her specific, unmistakable quality, her voice that sounds like patience with a slight catch in it, like warmth filtered through years of sustained effort. Kavner has said in interviews that the voice has become more difficult to maintain over the years, and that performing as Marge requires significant vocal effort. The fact that she has continued to give the character everything she has across 35 years is one of the remarkable quiet commitments in the history of the show. Nancy Cartwright's Bart has been discussed in the context of the character himself, but the specific physical discipline of voice acting for an animated character across decades is worth acknowledging. Cartwright has been performing Bart's voice since 1987, and the consistency of her performance, the way Bart at 35 years of animation, sounds like the same character who appeared in the first Tracy Ullman shorts, even as the show and the character have evolved, is a feat of sustained physical performance that rarely gets the credit it deserves. Yeardley Smith as Lisa and the late Harry Shearer, as a constellation of Springfield characters, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Mr. Burns, Kent Brockman, Lenny, Sideshow Bob's father. Actually, Sideshow Bob was and remains Kelsey Grammer, but Shearer voiced enormous numbers of supporting characters. Both brought specific qualities to their roles that are inseparable from the characters themselves. Shearer's departure from the show in 2015, a contract dispute that was eventually resolved and allowed him to return, created a period of significant disruption precisely because so many beloved characters were tied to a single voice that could not simply be replaced. Seth MacFarlane's contribution to Family Guy as a voice actor is in one sense even more extreme than the Simpsons cast, because MacFarlane voices not one but four of the show's main characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. The range required to inhabit all four of these characters, the bluff New England stupidity of Peter, the dry intellectual affect of Brian, the clipped British menace of Stewie, and the mid-century Vegas lounge singer quality of Quagmire, is genuinely remarkable, and the fact that MacFarlane performs all four with enough consistency and differentiation that audiences never confuse them is evidence of real vocal craft. He won an Emmy Award in 2000 for Outstanding Voiceover Performance for his work as Stewie, which makes him one of the few voice actors to receive major awards recognition for animated work. Alex Borstein as Lois, Seth Green as Chris, and Mila Kunis as Meg, who took over the role from Lacey Chabert in Season 2, complete the family's principal cast. Green's work as Chris is consistently underappreciated. The specific quality of his performance, the nasally adolescent quality that communicates awkwardness without tipping into caricature, is more precise than it looks. Kunis has said in interviews that she frequently found the later season's treatment of Meg frustrating to perform, not because of any professional difficulty, but because she understood Meg as a character with more depth than the show was allowing her to express in those years. The supporting voice casts of both shows deserve acknowledgement too. Patrick Stewart as Avery Bullock in American Dad, a MacFarlane-adjacent show worth mentioning here. Kelsey Grammer's decades-long performance as Sideshow Bob. Phil Hartman's work as recurring Simpsons characters before his death in 1998. Hartman voiced Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, two characters so tied to his specific performance that the show retired them, rather than recast them, which tells you everything about how irreplaceable his contributions were. All of these performances are part of what makes these shows feel as rich as they do. Expansion. C. Animation styles and what they mean. The visual design of both shows has changed significantly across their long histories, and those changes are not merely cosmetic. Animation style affects comedy in ways that are often not fully articulated, because we tend to think of animation as just the picture that carries the writing, the vehicle rather than part of the content. But the way a cartoon character moves, the expressiveness of their face, the specific quality of how violence and surprise and physical comedy are rendered, all of these things affect whether a joke lands and how it lands when it does. The Simpsons began with the rough, almost melted, Klasky Supo style of the original shorts, which had a specific organic quality to it. Characters whose movements felt slightly unpredictable, whose faces could make expressions that the more controlled later style would not allow. As the show moved through different animation studios and different technological approaches across its run, the look changed in ways that fans who watched the show through the 1990s and into the 2000s can identify almost by season. The early 1990s episodes have a specific quality of line and color that is different from the late 1990s episodes, which are different again from the post-movie 2007 era episodes, which introduced high-definition rendering that many fans regard as the death of the show's most appealing visual qualities. The show's most devoted visual period, in the golden years, had a specificity of expression in the characters' faces that allowed for enormous comedic range. Homer's expressions, the specific animation of his face when he is surprised, or guilty, or experiencing joy, or preparing to do something he knows is stupid, were calibrated with a precision that the cleaner, more consistent later style has never quite matched. Certain expressions from the early seasons, Homer's sheepish grin, Bart's specific variety of defiance, Lisa's very specific kind of sadness, have become iconic in ways that go beyond the episodes they appeared in, because the animation gave those expressions a particular flavor that was perfectly matched to the character. Family Guy's animation history is somewhat different but equally interesting. The original run in 1999 to 2002 had a rougher, slightly more fluid quality that reflected the influences McFarlane had absorbed at Hanna-Barbera and in his own student films. When the show returned in 2005, the animation was noticeably smoother and more consistent, but also, as many fans pointed out, somewhat stiffer. The characters moved with less of the loose energy that had made the original episodes visually engaging. The post-revival years saw the show continue to evolve its visual style, and by the later seasons, it had developed the clean, consistent aesthetic that is recognizable today. Characters who look identical from episode to episode, whose movements are precise and predictable, whose faces express a narrower range of emotions than the early seasons allowed. The physical comedy in both shows is also worth examining in terms of how it is animated. Homer's physical comedy in the classic years, the way his body reacted to impacts, the specific animation of his expressions when surprised or in pain, was handled with a kind of expressive exaggeration that was both funny and visually distinctive. The classic sideshow Bob stepping on rakes and Cape Fear works, as well as it does partly because of the specific timing and expressiveness of the animation. The way Bob's face and body register each rake with a specific quality of defeated resignation that makes the repetition funnier rather than less funny. Peter Griffin's physical comedy, and particularly the giant chicken fights, evolved across the show's history in ways that tracked closely with the evolution of the animation. The early chicken fights had a rougher, more improvisational quality. The later fights, produced with more sophisticated tools and larger budgets, are more elaborately choreographed and more visually spectacular, but some fans find them slightly less funny for all that. As if the rawness of the original had contributed to their comedy in ways that the polish of the later versions diminished. The crossover episode's animation was a specific creative challenge because it required accommodating two different visual systems in the same production. The solution, adjusting the Griffin family's designs to better fit Springfield's aesthetic while preserving their recognizability, was handled with more care than you might expect, and the result is an episode that looks more visually coherent than most crossovers manage to achieve. The specific decision to dim the whites of the Griffin's eyes, which Peter Shin made based on his experience with both shows, is a small detail that most viewers would not consciously notice, but that contributes significantly to the visual unity of the episode. Expansion D. The broader context. Other shows in the same conversation. Both The Simpsons and Family Guy exist within a larger ecosystem of American animated comedy that deserves some attention, if you want to understand how each one's choices look from a wider perspective. The conversation about which of these two shows is better is really a conversation about two specific approaches to a genre that includes many other shows, each with their own philosophy about what animated comedy is for and how it should work. King of the Hill, which ran on Fox from 1997 to 2010, occupies a fascinating position in this conversation because it represents a third approach that is distinct from both the Simpsons model and the Family Guy model. Created by Mike Judge and Greg Daniels, King of the Hill was a show built on naturalistic observation rather than satirical exaggeration. A comedy that found humor not in absurdism or in the gap between what characters wanted to be and who they actually were, but in the specific texture of ordinary life in a particular American community, rendered with an accuracy and warmth that bordered on documentary. The Hill family of Arlen, Texas, Hank, the propane salesman, his wife Peggy, his son Bobby, and his father Cotton, were not exaggerations of American suburban types. They were recognitions of them, drawn close enough to reality that watching the show sometimes felt less like watching a cartoon and more like watching a very carefully observed portrait of people you might actually know. The comedy was quieter than either Simpsons or Family Guy. The plots were smaller, and the emotional register was both more restrained and somehow more genuinely moving than either of its competitors managed in their later years. King of the Hill has never received the cultural attention that either The Simpsons or Family Guy has received, partly because its virtues are harder to describe and harder to clip into shareable internet content. But among people who watched it closely, it is regarded with something approaching reverence. South Park, created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, occupies yet another position, the one that is most explicitly positioned as a response to both The Simpsons and Family Guy, and that has made its position most loudly known through its own episodes. South Park's approach is closer to political cartoon than to sitcom. It prioritizes the satirical argument over the character, the immediate topical point over the long-term emotional investment, the willingness to say absolutely anything over the consistency of how anything is said. The show's production model, episodes produced in 6 days to allow response to current events, is itself a statement about what the show values. Relevance and speed over craft and depth. Though Parker and Stone would argue that their show has both relevance and craft, and they are not entirely wrong. Bob's Burgers, which has run on Fox since 2011, is in some ways the most interesting show to consider alongside Simpsons and Family Guy because it has managed to maintain the warmth and genuine family love that The Simpsons had in its golden years without ever quite achieving the satirical ambition or the cultural impact. The Belcher family, Bob, Linda, and their 3 children Tina, Jean, and Louise, love each other in a straightforward, uncomplicated way that the show never undercuts or ironizes. The family's love is the premise and the humor grows from it rather than existing despite it. Bob's Burgers has received excellent reviews throughout its run and has developed a devoted following, but it exists somewhat in the shadow of the two giants, whose network it shares, and the crossover episode acknowledged this explicitly. Bob Belcher from Bob's Burgers appears briefly in The Simpsons Guy, with Peter explaining that, "We gotta carry him 'cause he can't fly on his own." American Dad, Seth MacFarlane's second animated series, premiered in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation, and has in many ways outperformed its predecessor in quality, while receiving less cultural attention. The show focuses on the Smith family of Langley Falls, Virginia. CIA agent Stan Smith, his wife Francine, their children Haley and Steve, an alien named Roger who lives in their attic, and a German-speaking goldfish named Klaus, and has developed across its run into something genuinely surprising and genuinely excellent. American Dad does not use cutaway gags in the Family Guy style. Its stories are more coherently structured around its characters. Stan Smith, who began as a relatively one-dimensional satirical target, has developed into a complex and genuinely funny character whose conservatism is examined with more nuance than Family Guy has ever brought to any character's defining beliefs. Roger the alien, who can adopt different personas and effectively become different characters within the show, has become one of the great character creations in animated television. A comic concept so flexible and so endlessly generative that it has given the show's writers an effectively unlimited source of variety. The fact that American Dad, created by McFarlane, has often been regarded by critics and fans as the better show than Family Guy, also created by McFarlane, says something important about what happens when a show commits to structure and character over gag assembly. Both shows came from the same creator. Both shows had similar resources and similar talent in their rooms. The difference in outcome is a function of creative priorities. American Dad chose to build stories around its characters and paid dividends in consistency and quality across a long run. Family Guy chose to build gags around its characters and paid dividends in viral popularity and immediate entertainment value at some cost to the depth and consistency of the thing it was building. The relationship between the crossover episode and American Dad is worth noting briefly. Roger from American Dad appears in The Simpsons Guy, along with Bob Belcher from Bob's Burgers and Fred Flintstone. His presence in the crossover acknowledges the broader ecosystem of animated family comedy, of which all these shows are a part, and the specific humor of his appearance. Roger is simply in the background of various scenes, as if he belongs there, as if his presence requires no explanation, is very much in the Family Guy comic tradition of treating the absurd as unremarkable. Expansion E. The cultural weight. What these shows mean outside themselves. Both The Simpsons and Family Guy have become cultural phenomena in ways that extend far beyond their episodes. They have generated merchandise, theme park attractions, video games, academic study, and the kind of ambient cultural presence that means millions of people who have never watched either show closely still know who Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin are and what their defining characteristics are supposed to be. The Simpsons' cultural weight is older and deeper. Homer Simpson's dough was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001, making it one of the few words of entirely fictional origin to enter the lexicon as genuine vocabulary. The Simpsons movie in 2007 generated $527 million at the worldwide box office, which for a theatrical release based on a long-running television show is an extraordinary result and speaks to the brand's global recognition. Springfield has a real-world counterpart. There is a Springfield, Oregon, which has leaned into its connection to the show with varying degrees of enthusiasm over the years. And the show has attracted real-world political attention multiple times. From Bush's Walton's comment in 1992 to the episode about Venezuela's reaction to a marijuana-themed episode. The show's academic study is substantial. Literature departments have used Simpsons episodes as teaching texts. Philosophy courses have been organized around the show's moral dilemmas. Cultural studies scholars have written about the show's relationship to postmodern irony, its treatment of American consumerism, its use of Springfield as a satirical mirror for national self-conception. There are books, many books, dedicated to the serious analysis of The Simpsons as a cultural artifact, some of which are genuinely illuminating and some of which demonstrate more enthusiasm than analytical precision. The Simpsons' peculiar reputation for predicting the future has also become a cultural phenomenon in its own right. The show has, across its decades of episodes, depicted events that subsequently occurred in ways that range from genuinely coincidental to genuinely impressive. A 2000 episode predicted Donald Trump's presidency. Various episodes have depicted technologies that later became real. The show has been used, over and over, as evidence of both the show's writers' prescience and the public's appetite for finding patterns and coincidence. Whether any of these predictions reflect genuine insight or simply the statistical inevitability of a show that has depicted thousands of hypothetical scenarios finding matches in real events is a more interesting question than most of the coverage of this phenomenon acknowledges. Family Guy's cultural weight is different in texture but equally significant in scale. The show has been the subject of intense regulatory attention from the Parents Television Council, which has placed it on its list of worst primetime shows for family viewing multiple times since its premiere. It has been banned or threatened with banning in various countries for content deemed offensive. The Venezuelan government's reaction to a marijuana-themed episode, which led to cable stations in Venezuela being warned they would be fined for airing the show, is one of the more remarkable examples of an animated comedy generating genuine geopolitical controversy. The show's specific vocabulary has entered internet culture in ways that are harder to track than The Simpsons' dictionary contributions, but possibly equally pervasive. The word giggity and its variants, Quagmire's expression of male desire and enthusiasm, has entered common usage in online contexts. Stewie's various expressions and attitudes have been adopted as templates for internet humor. Brian's pretension has become a shorthand for a specific kind of intellectual affectation. These character-based contributions to internet vocabulary are different from The Simpsons' contributions, but represent the same kind of cultural penetration. The show becoming part of the ambient reference material through which people communicate. The academic study of Family Guy is more limited than that of The Simpsons, partly because the show has been less inclined to present itself as a serious cultural statement, and partly because its formal approach, the cutaway gag as primary comic mechanism, is harder to analyze in terms of traditional narrative or satirical theory. There have been attempts, particularly around questions of the show's treatment of gender, race, disability, and class, but the academic literature on Family Guy is considerably thinner than on The Simpsons. What both shows share in terms of their cultural weight is the specific quality of longevity that creates a kind of inevitability. Shows that have been on the air for 35 years and 30 years, respectively, become part of the background of life in a way that newer and sometimes better shows cannot replicate. You do not choose to encounter The Simpsons or Family Guy in the way you might choose to encounter a new streaming series. You encounter them because they are always there, in syndication, in streaming libraries, in references made by people who grew up with them, in the vocabulary you absorb from the people around you. They have become part of the cultural furniture of American life in a way that is almost impossible to undo and that gives both shows a presence and an influence that their current creative output alone would not justify. Expansion F. Stewie and Brian, the odd couple at the center. The relationship between Stewie Griffin and Brian Griffin deserves its own extended discussion because it became, over the course of Family Guy's run, the most consistently interesting and the most consistently well-executed element of the show. In a show whose primary mode is the disconnected gag, Stewie and Brian together represent something different. A genuine relationship with real history and real emotional stakes that the show has returned to again and again, and that has produced some of its most significant work. The relationship began in the earliest seasons as a consequence of Brian being one of the only characters who could actually hear and understand Stewie. Most of the other adults in Stewie's life perceived him as an ordinary baby. They heard babbling where the audience heard sophisticated British monologue. They saw a normal infant where the audience saw an evil genius. Brian saw Stewie clearly, for reasons the show never fully explained, but that presumably had something to do with Brian's own unusual status as a dog who could think and speak and had developed something like a human personality. This shared experience of being not quite what they appeared to be, of being extraordinary beings living in an ordinary world, gave their relationship a foundation that was different from any other relationship in the show. In the early seasons, the relationship was one of mutual recognition more than genuine friendship. Stewie respected Brian's intelligence. Brian found Stewie alternately impressive and alarming. They had conversations that the other characters could not fully participate in, and those conversations were a source of genuine comedy. The dry wit of the dog meeting the baroque villainy of the baby, producing an unusual chemistry that the show recognized early as something special. As the show developed and Stewie's character shifted away from world domination toward more emotionally complex territory, the friendship with Brian became the primary vehicle for that shift. The road trip episodes, Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, gave the relationship room to breathe and develop in ways that the main family storylines often could not. These episodes have their own distinctive quality, more structured than typical Family Guy episodes, with actual plot arcs that develop across the full runtime, with Stewie and Brian's dynamic doing genuine emotional work, rather than simply providing a framework for gags. The Road to the Multiverse episode, in which Stewie's remote control takes him and Brian through various alternate universes, is frequently cited as one of the best episodes the show has produced in any era. Funny, imaginative, and using the Stewie-Brian dynamic to say something real about how we relate to the people we are closest to. The Brian and Stewie bottle episode, discussed at several points elsewhere in the script, is the relationship at its most exposed and most honest. Two characters alone in a confined space with no cutaways and no rescue, having conversations about what they actually are and what their lives actually feel like. Brian's revelation about the gun in his safety deposit box, that he keeps it for the moments when he cannot find a reason to continue, is the single most emotionally significant moment in the show's history, rendered with a seriousness and a vulnerability that the show had never before attempted and has rarely managed since. Stewie's response, the absolute refusal to accept this, the insistence that Brian's life matters and specifically that it matters to him, is not played as comedy at all. It is played as genuine feeling, which is what makes it work as well as it does. The relationship has also been the source of some of the show's most discussed and most criticized moments in the later seasons, particularly around Brian's character decline. Brian's treatment of Stewie in episodes where he becomes arrogant or cruel. The Brian Writes a Bestseller episode in which Brian becomes insufferable in the aftermath of unexpected literary success and treats Stewie with contempt rather than the gratitude Stewie's encouragement deserves, is painful specifically because of how the relationship has been established. When Brian is cruel to Stewie, the show has established enough history between them that the cruelty lands differently than it would in a show without that history. It is not just funny or shocking, it is a betrayal of something specific and real, and the audience feels it as such. The crossover episode uses the Stewie-Brian relationship as one of its quieter through lines. The episode primarily focuses on Stewie's infatuation with Bart, but Brian's own experience in Springfield, finding himself at the Simpsons house, meeting Santa's little helper, navigating a world without his particular relationship with Stewie, adds a dimension to the episode that is easy to overlook. Brian without Stewie is noticeably different from Brian with Stewie, and the episode acknowledges this without making it a major point. It is a small piece of character work that rewards attention. Expansion. G. Homer's intelligence and Peter's cruelty. The slow divergence. One of the most discussed and most carefully documented aspects of both shows' long histories is the way their lead characters changed over time, and specifically the way both Homer's intelligence and Peter's basic decency eroded as the seasons accumulated. Both changes have been given names by fans. Homer's is sometimes called the transition to jerk-ass Homer, and Peter's transformation has been described in terms of Flanderization, the process by which a character is progressively reduced to their most extreme trait until they barely resemble who they were at the beginning. Homer Simpson's intelligence in the first 4 seasons of the show was low, but not non-functional. He was stupid in a way that was compatible with genuine feeling, with occasional insight, and with a limited but real capacity for learning from experience. He could be moved by beauty. He had musical taste. The jazz episode is one of the clearest examples of Homer's interior life being taken seriously by the show, of the character having a specific set of aesthetic preferences, rather than simply being a vessel for comedy about stupidity. He had a genuine and consistently expressed love for his family that existed independently of his many failures as a husband and father. The love was real, even when the execution was terrible. What happened to Homer's intelligence across the show's long history has been analyzed in multiple ways. Some fans trace it to specific creative decisions, the departure of certain writers, the change in showrunners at specific points, while others see it as the inevitable consequence of comedy inflation, the process by which jokes that were moderately funny at one level of absurdity require escalation to be as funny in subsequent seasons, leading characters progressively further from the behaviors that made them initially recognizable. Both explanations have merit. Both are probably contributing factors. The jerk-ass Homer period, which fans identify most clearly with the Mike Scully showrunner era from roughly season 9 through season 12, saw Homer doing things that were not just stupid but genuinely mean, treating people around him with active contempt, behaving in ways that could not be excused by ignorance or impulsiveness, and that had to be attributed to a willingness to harm others that the earlier character did not possess. Episodes in which Homer treated his father badly, his wife badly, and his children badly in ways that the show did not adequately acknowledge or resolve became more frequent. The comedy was still there in these episodes, but the warmth that had balanced the stupidity was noticeably thinner. Peter Griffin's trajectory is in some ways more extreme and more sudden. The early seasons of Family Guy established Peter as warm-hearted in a way that was genuine, rather than merely gestured toward. He was not smart, and he was not reliably responsible, but he loved Lois and he loved his kids, and when he messed up, he felt it. The post-revival seasons, beginning from 2005, showed Peter's empathy gradually diminishing and his willingness to hurt the people around him gradually increasing. By the later seasons, Peter was doing things to his own family, and specifically to Meg, that the character of the first 3 seasons would not have recognized as consistent with who he was. The Meg situation is particularly stark when measured against the Simpsons comparator. In The Simpsons, each family member has storylines that allow them to be the most interesting person in the room. Bart's stories give him complexity and agency. Lisa's stories give her depth and consequence. Even Maggie, who barely speaks, has episodes that treat her inner life with respect. In Family Guy, Meg progressively became the target of the show rather than a participant in it. A character who existed primarily to be hurt, and whose hurt was presented as comedy rather than as a problem requiring engagement. The crossover episode navigated the Meg situation with more grace than most Family Guy episodes did. The Lisa and Meg pairing, brief as it was, acknowledged implicitly that Meg had been failed by the show that created her, and that what she needed was what Lisa could provide: recognition. Lisa saw Meg's actual capabilities rather than the role the show had assigned her, and Meg responded. The scene works not just as character interaction, but as a kind of internal commentary. The show acknowledging, through Lisa Simpson's perspective, that it had been doing something wrong with Meg and that there was another way. Whether that acknowledgement carried through to subsequent Family Guy episodes is a fair question, and the answer is complicated. The show did gradually pull back from the worst of the Meg treatment in the seasons following the crossover, and by the later years, Meg had storylines that treated her with more respect than the middle seasons had managed. Whether this was a consequence of the crossover's implicit critique, or of the writing room's own evolving awareness of the problem, or simply of the general evolution of the show's sensibility over time, is impossible to say with certainty. But the change was real, and the crossover episode's engagement with Meg's situation was part of the broader conversation that led to it. The convergence point in the crossover episode, where Homer and Peter both demonstrate their best and worst qualities in compressed form across 44 minutes, is also a compressed demonstration of how differently the two shows have handled the central question of what to do with a character who is both the audience's identification figure and the show's primary comic mechanism. Homer, even in his post-Golden Age form, retains enough of his original warmth that the crossover can use him as the generous host. Peter, even in his best moments in the episode, retains enough of his later cruelty that the conflict between him and Homer is believable rather than arbitrary. The crossover made visible in a single episode the distance between where these two characters started and where their respective shows had taken them. Expansion H: What endures? When people who love these shows are asked to describe what they love about them, the answers are surprisingly consistent across fans of both, and they reveal something important about what both shows achieved at their best. What endures from The Simpsons, most commonly cited, is the feeling of recognition. The feeling that the show understood something about your family, your neighborhood, your country, your experience of being alive in America at the end of the 20th century, and rendered it with enough honesty and enough love that watching it felt like being seen. The show at its best made people feel understood in a way that television rarely manages, and that feeling of being understood is what people mean when they say they love the show, not just enjoy it or respect it or find it funny. What endures from Family Guy, most commonly cited, is the feeling of surprise. The specific pleasure of a joke that arrived from a direction you were not looking in, that committed fully to its absurd premise, that went on longer than you expected and got funnier rather than less funny as it continued. The pleasure of a show that seemed genuinely free of the constraints that other shows imposed on themselves, that would go anywhere and do anything in pursuit of the next laugh, that trusted its audience to keep up with whatever it produced. This freedom, experienced at its best, is genuinely exhilarating, in a way that is different from the recognition The Simpsons produces, but equally real. Both feelings are what comedy can give you. Both are worth pursuing. Both have been given to millions of people by these two shows across their decades of Sunday nights and streaming availability and reruns and DVD sets and every other way that people have found to stay connected to the worlds they care about. The Simpsons has been on television for 35 years and Family Guy for 30. Between them, they have produced more than 1,000 episodes of animated comedy, an astonishing body of work spanning multiple decades, reflecting an enormous range of cultural moments and creative choices, building two fictional worlds that millions of people know as well as they know their own neighborhoods. All of that history is in the room when Homer and Peter agree, in the crossover episode's final scene, that they will always remain half an hour apart with a pile of garbage between them. The pile of garbage is the joke. The distance is the point. The acknowledgement that they are not the same, that they cannot be the same, that the difference between them is necessary and real and should not be erased. That is the most honest thing the crossover could have said, and it said it. These two shows will keep going. They will keep producing episodes that remind you why you love them, and episodes that remind you why some people think they should have ended years ago. They will keep being watched and rewatched and argued about in comment sections and Reddit threads and conversations late at night when the episode is over and someone says, "Okay, but which one do you actually prefer?" The answer is still that you do not have to choose. The answer is still that the question was never the right one. The shows are not competing for your love the way they compete for ratings. Your love for one does not diminish your love for the other. Both have earned what they have received. These stories will be here when you wake up. That is more than enough. Expansion 1. The Sunday night lineup and what it meant for both shows. There is something worth sitting with about the specific fact of Sunday night. For most of both shows' histories, Sunday night at 8 o'clock on Fox was not simply a time slot. It was a cultural institution. The animation domination block, as Fox eventually branded it, was a moment in the weekly calendar when a specific kind of American comedy gathered in one place and an enormous audience gathered around it. Both The Simpsons and Family Guy were central to that institution, and the relationship between the two shows as neighbors in the same lineup shaped both of them in ways that are hard to fully disentangle. Being adjacent to each other in the same lineup meant that both shows were always, at some level, in dialogue with what the other show had just done. An audience member who watched The Simpsons at 8 and then turned to Family Guy at 9, or who watched them in reverse order as the lineup changed across different seasons and different network decisions, was making an implicit comparison every week, whether they were aware of it or not. The jokes they laughed at, the characters they cared about, the emotional registers they moved through. All of this was shaped by the specific sequence of the evening's programming, and by the knowledge that both shows existed in the same universe of broadcast television, sharing a time slot and a network and an audience and, to some extent, a destiny. The Sunday night lineup also functioned as a kind of comedy laboratory, a place where different approaches to animated humor could be tested against each other in real time, in front of the same audience week after week. When The Simpsons was clearly the dominant show in quality and audience affection, Family Guy existed in its shadow, and the shadow was visible in the reviews and the cultural conversation. When Family Guy returned from cancellation in 2005 with renewed energy and a massive online audience that the network wanted to capture, the dynamic shifted, and The Simpsons found itself in an unusual position. Not exactly in Family Guy's shadow, because The Simpsons' institutional prestige was too deeply established for that, but certainly in a more contested space than it had previously occupied. The presence of King of the Hill, which ran on the same Sunday lineup for many years, adds another dimension to this picture. King of the Hill's naturalistic approach, its quieter comedy, and its deep investment in character and place provided a weekly contrast to both The Simpsons' heightened satire and Family Guy's rapid-fire gags. Having all three shows in the same lineup on the same network made the differences between them vivid in a way that watching any one of them in isolation would not. The existence of the lineup was itself an argument about what animated comedy could do, about the range of approaches possible within a single genre on a single network. The demise of animation domination as a consistent cultural institution, the result of declining linear television viewership, the spread of time-shifted watching, and the eventual departure of King of the Hill from the lineup, changed the context in which both The Simpsons and Family Guy existed. The shows did not change, the experience of watching them did. A show watched on Hulu 2 days after its broadcast premiere saw, in isolation from the other shows that would have surrounded it in the linear schedule, is a different experience from the same show watched live in sequence as part of an evening's entertainment. This shift in viewing context may be one of the less discussed factors in how both shows are evaluated today, particularly by younger viewers who have never experienced the Sunday night lineup as a live communal event. The crossover episode was in some ways a final acknowledgement of that communal history. By 2014, the era of the Sunday night animated comedy block as a dominant cultural institution was already fading. The episode chose to treat the relationship between its two shows not as a competition, but as a shared history. As something that had accumulated across 15 years of being neighbors in the same cultural space, with all the affection and irritation and occasional open hostility that extended cohabitation tends to produce. The pile of garbage between them at the episode's end was funny, but it was also a kind of memorial, an acknowledgement that the era of these two shows defining each other by their proximity was winding down, and that the relationship was worth marking before it changed. Both shows continue to air on Fox on Sunday nights, though the lineup around them has changed significantly and the audience that gathers for them live is considerably smaller than it once was. The institution persists even as its cultural centrality fades, and the audience that still gathers for it, the people who watch live, who discuss the episodes on social media as they air, who maintain the weekly ritual of Sunday night animation, represents a continuity with the millions who have watched these shows across the decades. A living connection to a cultural tradition that the shows themselves helped to create. Expansion J, the families as American archetypes and what they still say. Both shows have always been doing something larger than making people laugh, even when making people laugh was the explicit goal. Both shows have been constructing archetypes, idealized or satirized versions of recognizable American types, that function as mirrors in which audiences see themselves and their families reflected back in distorted but recognizable form. The distortion is the comedy. The recognition is the reason the comedy works. Homer Simpson is an archetype of American masculine inadequacy made benign. He is the man who wants to be the provider and protector and patriarch, but who lacks the intelligence and discipline to consistently be any of those things, and who compensates with warmth and enthusiasm and a genuine capacity for love that makes him sympathetic rather than pathetic. He is the man who has accepted that he is not exceptional and is trying to be decent within those constraints, and who fails at that too, and who keeps trying anyway. This is not a comfortable archetype. It is not flattering to be Homer Simpson, but it is a recognizable one, and the recognition is the source of the comedy's warmth. Marge Simpson is an archetype of American feminine endurance made complex. She is the woman who holds the family together through sheer force of patience and love and domestic competence, who has subordinated her own ambitions and desires to the maintenance of a family unit that would collapse without her, and who knows this and lives with it and occasionally resents it and always returns to it. She is an archetype of the woman who is stronger than the institutions around her, but too invested in those institutions to simply leave them. This too is a recognizable type, and the show's best episodes, the ones that take Marge seriously as a person rather than simply as a stabilizing force, treat the recognition with the complexity it deserves. Peter Griffin is an archetype of something slightly different. American masculine impulsivity without sufficient internal regulation. He is Homer pushed past the point where Homer's warmth keeps the impulsivity benign, into territory where the impulsivity causes real harm. The archetype Peter represents is the man who has never learned to check his impulses against the needs of the people around him, who treats the world as a space for the expression of his own desires, rather than a shared space that requires consideration. This is a darker archetype than Homer's, and the fact that Family Guy has pushed Peter progressively further into this territory as the series has continued is one of the reasons that the show's critics find later season Peter less sympathetic and sometimes genuinely troubling. Lois Griffin is an archetype that Family Guy has treated less consistently than The Simpsons has treated Marge, but at its best represents something specific. The woman who married down and knows it and chose to do it anyway, because the qualities that attracted her to Peter, his uncomplicated love, his occasional surprising generosity, the specific comfort of someone who needed her, were worth the price of managing everything he couldn't manage himself. This is an archetype of a specific kind of compromised domestic intelligence, the intelligence of someone who has made a calculation that other people would judge and who has decided not to care about the judgment. Bart Simpson is an archetype of American adolescent rebellion, the child who recognizes that the institutions adults have built are inadequate, who responds to that recognition with defiance rather than accommodation, who has not yet learned whether defiance is a viable long-term strategy or simply the first act of a longer story. He is every kid who has ever looked at the school system and the authority structure around them and thought, "This is not designed with my interests in mind, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." The show respects this perspective in a way that most children's television never managed. Stewie Griffin was, at his original conception, an archetype of something genuinely unusual. The intelligence that arrives too early, that is formed before it has the context to understand itself, that finds itself equipped with extraordinary capabilities in a situation that cannot accommodate them and responds with the only tools available: aggression, manipulation, schemes. The evil genius baby is funny because the archetype is recognizable in a different register. Every exceptionally intelligent child who found themselves surrounded by people who couldn't quite see them, who developed a certain protective cynicism as a result, who built elaborate internal worlds as compensation for external inadequacy. Stewie's world domination plots are the grandiose fantasies of an extraordinarily bright child who has nowhere to put his brightness, and the comedy comes from the sincerity with which he pursues them. These archetypes, and the relationships between them, are what give both shows their enduring quality, the quality that makes them more than simply funny television, that makes them something people return to decades after first watching, that makes the debates about them feel genuinely important rather than merely argumentative. You are not arguing about which animated show has better jokes. You are arguing about which version of these American archetypes feels more true, which portrait of this specific kind of family feels more honest, which comedy serves the recognition better. Those arguments are about real things. That is why they persist. The crossover episode was, at one level, an argument about all of this conducted in the form of a 44-minute animated comedy. It was asking, when you put the Simpsons version of these archetypes next to the Family Guy version, what do you see? The answer it offered was that both versions are real in their own way, that the two shows illuminate different aspects of the same archetypes, that the difference between them is not a matter of one being right and the other wrong, but of two different sets of creative choices producing two different truths about the same recognizable American family. Half an hour apart, a pile of garbage between them, both right, both necessary. Expansion K, the quiet lessons both shows taught about comedy writing. There is a strange irony in the fact that two of the most commercially successful animated comedies in the history of American television have collectively taught more people about the craft of comedy writing than most formal programs in the subject. Not deliberately, not through any pedagogical intent, but through the specific quality of their success and failure. Through the way that their best episodes demonstrate, in action, what great comedy writing does, and the way their worst episodes demonstrate, equally clearly, what happens when great comedy writing is replaced by something else. The Simpsons at its peak taught that jokes are not interruptions of a story, but expressions of it. That the funniest thing in any scene is usually the most honest thing, the thing that captures exactly what is true about who these people are in this moment, compressed into the smallest possible space. That comedy is the art of precision, not the art of excess. That a joke which makes three separate true observations simultaneously is geometrically more satisfying than a joke which makes one observation very loudly. That setup is everything. If you have done the setup correctly, the payoff is almost incidental. The Simpsons also taught that emotional honesty and comedy are not in tension, but in collaboration. The funniest scenes in the golden era are often also the most emotionally true. Homer and Bart at the father-son picnic. Marge waiting at the bar for Homer to come home. Lisa alone with her saxophone in the auditorium before the concert. These scenes are funny. They are also real in a way that television comedy had not previously managed to be, and the realness is what makes them funny rather than what limits the comedy. The emotional honesty is not a concession made to feeling at the expense of laughter. It is what the laughter is made of. Family Guy at its best taught that commitment to a premise is its own kind of craft, and that the willingness to go further than convention suggests. To stay in the bit longer, to escalate past the point where a lesser show would have exited, to trust the audience to follow you somewhere uncomfortable, is a legitimate source of comedy that requires its own kind of precision and its own kind of courage. The chicken fights were not accidents. They were the result of someone in the room understanding that the funniest version of this particular joke required going longer and further than instinct would have suggested, and having the confidence to insist on that. Family Guy also taught, inadvertently, something about the limitations of disconnected comedy. That a show built primarily on standalone gags, however well executed, cannot produce the specific kind of emotional depth that comes from sustained attention to consistent characters. The show's best episodes, the bottle episode, the road trips, demonstrate that the show was always capable of that depth and simply chose not to pursue it consistently. The choice not to pursue it was itself a choice about what comedy is for, and the consequences of that choice are visible in the show's history. Both shows are now part of the curriculum, informal, unexamined, but real, of every person who grew up watching them and went on to think seriously about what comedy can do. They produced generations of fans who became writers, comedians, producers, critics, who carry the specific lessons of these shows into their own work, whether they know it or not. The Simpsons' lesson about the necessity of character and emotional honesty. Family Guy's lesson about the power of commitment and the freedom that comes from releasing yourself from conventional structure. Both lessons are valuable. Both are part of what these shows contributed to the culture beyond their episodes and their ratings and their merchandise. That contribution is not small. It is, in fact, one of the most significant things either show achieved. The creation of a generation of comedy fans who understand something about what great comedy does and why, who have internalized standards that they can apply not just to these two shows, but to everything they watch. The argument about which show is better is, at its deepest level, an argument conducted in terms those shows themselves taught people to use. That recursiveness, the shows teaching the audience the standards by which the audience judges the shows, is one of the most remarkable things about the long history of both of them. Sleep well with all of that. Sleep well with. These are the kinds of thoughts that are worth having on a quiet night, when there is nothing pressing and the show is over, and you are left with the slightly wistful feeling that good television always produces. The feeling that you have been somewhere real for a while, somewhere that understood something about you, and now you are back in your ordinary life with whatever the experience gave you. Both shows gave something real. Both of them earned it. That is enough. Expansion L, a note on longevity and what it reveals. There is a question worth sitting with at the end of all of this. Why do these shows continue? Not just in the commercial sense, the streaming rights and the syndication deals and the merchandise and the brand recognition are sufficient explanation for why Fox keeps ordering seasons, but in a deeper sense. Why do audiences continue watching? Why do new generations of viewers, who could choose from an effectively unlimited library of television content, choose to watch The Simpsons and Family Guy in significant enough numbers to justify their continuation? The answer, when you look at it honestly, is not nostalgia alone. Nostalgia is powerful, but it does not explain first-time viewers discovering these shows through streaming and developing genuine attachments to them. It does not explain the people who, having watched the Simpsons movie or a viral Family Guy clip, go back and watch the earliest seasons with something close to wonder at what these shows were when they were at their best. Nostalgia is part of the answer for people who grew up with these shows. But something else is operating for the people who are finding them now for the first time, with no childhood attachment to color their response. What those first-time viewers are finding is that the best versions of both shows do something that is genuinely rare in entertainment. They tell the truth about ordinary people in a way that feels true even to people whose lives are very different from the ones being depicted. Homer Simpson's specific disappointments are not universal, but the feeling of being the person who wanted to be better and settled for what they actually are, that is universal. Peter Griffin's specific obliviousness is not universal. But the feeling of bumbling through a life you haven't fully chosen, surrounded by people who are somehow still there despite everything, that is universal. The longevity of these shows is also partly a function of the fact that they got there first. They arrived at specific moments in American television history when the kind of comedy they were making was new, or newer than it had been, and they made enormous impressions on audiences who were encountering this kind of comedy for the first time. Those impressions are not easily displaced. A show that makes a deep impression on you at the right age, at the age when you are first beginning to understand comedy as something more than just something that makes you laugh, as something that reveals truth, leaves a mark that subsequent shows have to work very hard to match, regardless of their quality. The Simpsons made that impression on an entire generation in the 1990s, and Family Guy made a similar impression on a generation in the early 2000s. The loyalty of those audiences, the specific personal loyalty of people who felt seen and understood by a particular show at a particular moment, is what sustains both shows past the point that their creative quality alone would justify. You keep watching because you are, in some sense, still watching for the version of the show that first got you, still hoping for the next episode that will feel the way the best episodes felt, still giving the show the benefit of the doubt because of what it was even when what it is seems like less. This is not a failure of critical judgment. It is a recognition of what television does at its best. It creates relationships between shows and audiences that are more like human relationships than like the transactional relationships you have with most forms of entertainment. You do not simply evaluate The Simpsons. You have a history with The Simpsons, and having a history with something changes how you experience it, in the same way that having a history with a person changes how you respond to them. Both shows are worth the history. Both shows earned the relationships they have with their audiences. And on the nights when you can settle in and let the story carry you, when the questions of which show is better and what the crossover proved can wait until tomorrow, both shows have something to offer that nothing else quite replicates. That is the final word on the matter. Not which show wins, but that both of them, in their different ways, on their different nights, gave people something worth having. And that the argument about which one gave more is, in the end, the argument of people who got something from both. This is a wonderful thing to fall asleep to.